This dungeon was supposed to be a training exercise. Then a double-headed Hydra woke up and turned the score sheet into a survival timer. Setsuna learned that the boss would regenerate from every ordinary slash, so he cut both heads at once and made the impossible monster fall. Before he could even breathe, Giovanni applauded from the ruins. The man behind the dungeon trap was not finished pretending to be human. His body opened into a purple-flamed monster, with enough power to erase the whole team. Cornered and nearly unconscious, Setsuna begged a fire spirit for help. The spirit answered by burning him inside another dimension. He came back carrying a power that even Giovanni was afraid to touch. Then one close combat grab became Inferno Blaze, and the forbidden power followed him home as a tiny creature that threatened to burn the academy. But before this fire followed him home, the world was already ending, and that is where the story begins. Humanity stands at extinction's edge as soldiers fight monsters. The catastrophe began when evil god Vindrake appeared in the sky. Countless monsters swarmed across the land, overwhelming every defense. Their advance left destruction behind and forced brutal resistance. The invasion kept charging forward like one unstoppable wave. Even a massive explosion could scatter the enemy briefly. Above the carnage, Vindrake watched with glowing red eyes. Humanity's last hope stood together. 5 powerful mages. They were mankind's strongest defense against the evil god. Setsuna gathered power for one desperate attack. Energy spiraled around his hand as the spell grew dangerous. The monsters kept pressing in, leaving no room for mistakes. Still, the mages held their tight formation above the chaos. Setsuna ordered everyone to prepare their magic spells. Their combined magic erupted across the battlefield. Setsuna called Vindrake by name as the attack peaked. He declared the evil god's reign finished here. Then, Setsuna combined all 6 magic attributes at once. Elemental Burst tore forward as a gigantic energy beam. Its impact carved a crater through the battlefield. The other mages poured their remaining mana into Setsuna's attack. Their teamwork produced one final flash of destructive light. For one breath, the exhausted mages believed they succeeded. Then, Vindrake emerged from the smoke completely unharmed. Their strongest spell had not forced him to retreat. The mages stared in shock as their attack failed. Some still raised their magic, refusing to surrender. Setsuna stopped them and demanded they observe Vindrake. Their magic had been dispelled before it could harm him. Vindrake mocked them and questioned humanity's best effort. He called the mages insects rotting inside his garden. Panic spread as the mages looked to Setsuna for orders. Setsuna searched desperately for any remaining option. Vindrake answered with a devastating attack on the defenders. The mages were overwhelmed, and survival became unlikely. Even one staff began losing its magical power. A terrified mage admitted she was running out of mana. Another cried for Setsuna while Vindrake removed every escape. One mage was struck down as the resistance collapsed. Setsuna watched in horror as his comrades fell. He shouted for the attackers to stop, but it was too late. Vindrake turned his devastating attack toward Setsuna. Setsuna finally understood that humanity had lost. He collapsed wounded while the battlefield fell silent around him. Even on his knees, Setsuna refused to accept this ending. Blood covered his face as every comrade disappeared. Burning ground and fallen allies proved mankind's defeat. Vindrake called their struggle futile, but Setsuna kept resisting. With almost nothing left, Setsuna lunged forward again. His punch connected and caught Vindrake off guard. The evil god reacted with sudden irritation. Setsuna realized the attack had actually worked. Vindrake could not explain how low-level magic hurt him. Setsuna saw a possible way to defeat the evil god. The flames around his hand revealed a crucial clue. Vindrake declared that Setsuna's journey ended there. A surge of magic struck Setsuna directly in the chest. Blue energy pierced through him before he could act. That pain recalled the headmaster placing a blue necklace in his hands. The necklace of rebirth could redo past regrets exactly once. Setsuna focused on the word regrets, because he remembered none. The headmaster laughed at Setsuna's confident answer. He had given Setsuna the necklace because its future value was certain. Back in the present, Setsuna finally named his regret. He regretted choosing the wrong magic path and swore to win this time. When the light vanished, Setsuna touched his forehead in confusion. Leo reminded him it was his turn, as though the apocalypse never happened. Setsuna froze after recognizing Leo alive beside him. Leo was supposed to disappear before Vindrake appeared. The Academy confirmed that Setsuna had returned 10 years into the past. Now he had one mission: prevent humanity's defeat. Leo pulled him back to the ceremony of blessings. Setsuna walked forward, carrying knowledge no classmate possessed. His classmates whispered that the Academy's greatest genius mastered every affinity. The instructor opened the book that would decide Setsuna's path. The ceremony began by explaining magic's different paths. Each path required a separate technique, making several forms difficult. Choosing between them resembled believing in 2 gods simultaneously. The instructor ordered Setsuna Cromwell to choose his desired path. Long-range magic looked obvious because it built Setsuna's former reputation. From a distance, elemental attacks kept a mage relatively safe. Yet even the world's strongest long-range mage had failed Vindrake. Setsuna turned away from the safe choice instead. His steps carried him toward a symbol everyone else ignored. Each step made retreat more embarrassing and the decision more public. When he stopped before close combat magic, the instructor answered with shock. The classmates reacted because the abandoned path looked like academic suicide. Leo confronted Setsuna about promising long-range magic that morning. To Leo, close combat was the worst possible choice for a genius. The instructor explained that close combat focused on body enhancement. He compared it to facing arrows with only a stone axe. Setsuna admitted the path looked hopeless for an ordinary mage. Then memories of fallen soldiers reminded him why ordinary answers failed. Against Vindrake, Setsuna believed close combat was the only choice. He reached toward the symbol and locked in his decision. The instructor and classmates watched silently as every warning failed. An older white-haired man observed the ceremony without revealing his thoughts. Golden energy gathered around Setsuna's hand as he claimed close combat magic. The connection strengthened, proving the choice could not be undone. Setsuna promised to beat Vindrake and begin a journey that could shake the world. Setsuna tested the glowing mark on his forearm after choosing close combat magic. The intricate sigil pulsed, linking his new path to power from his first life. He clenched his fist and confirmed the activation with a confident smile. Students noticed the display and immediately filled the hallway with whispers. A book slammed shut nearby, announcing that someone was already furious. Cyrus Arclight had expected Setsuna to join the long-range department. He shouted that Setsuna could have become the strongest mage under his guidance. Setsuna stayed calm because glory meant nothing against the future he remembered. Humanity would fall in 10 years, while Vindrake would appear after only 5. His problem was simple: future knowledge, but almost no practical, close combat experience. Cyrus kept glaring as Setsuna walked away from the argument. Setsuna then realized he did not know where close combat classes were held. He scanned the hallway and noticed Leo was missing again. Setsuna asked nearby students to guide him to the correct classroom. The students hurried because class was already about to begin. Their whispers made it clear that Setsuna's new department had changed their attitude. They mocked his choice and predicted that close combat would teach him a lesson. Setsuna noticed the difference from his first life and decided to find the room alone. A campus map in the courtyard gave him the fastest route. Before he reached it, a fireball streaked past his head. A fight had broken out inside the academy, which made no sense for a school. A female student hit the ground beneath the magical attack. She struggled up and demanded that the attackers return her property. The stolen item was a brooch her mother had sacrificed to buy. Its design revealed that the brooch was also a valuable mana tool. 3 long-range students mocked her and planned to keep the high-class item. Setsuna identified the victim as close combat and the bullies as long-range students. One senior told her to take the brooch back by force. He added that close combat magic was too weak to matter. Another fireball slammed near the student and left her helpless. But physical enhancement could not erase the reach advantage of 3 long-range mages. The student refused to surrender the brooch her mother had saved years to purchase. She formed a mana blade, trying to create an answer at close range. Setsuna watched the technique and immediately saw its limitations. The long-range students laughed because they believed the fight was already over. One senior even questioned whether her dagger could reach him. She tried to attack, but the distance kept turning every move against her. Another explosion knocked her down while the seniors laughed. The senior insisted that close combat could never reach long-range mages. A fireball cut through the air, making his threat look convincing. The student lay trapped on the ground as the next attack approached. Then Setsuna crossed the distance fast enough to intercept the attack. The rescued student's eye reflected Setsuna arriving between her and danger. He caught her and shielded her from the continuing magical barrage. The 3 seniors stared because Setsuna had appeared without warning. Setsuna simply asked the rescued student for directions to his department. She could only answer with a confused stare. Then she recognized the famous Setsuna Cromwell in front of her. The seniors noticed the mark on his hand and realized he chose close combat. Instead of backing off, the senior smiled at the chance to bully another target. He assumed close combat meant Setsuna could be beaten without consequences. Setsuna admitted the field was weak, then added that weakness depended on usage. His future experience had already shown him room for improvement. The quality of a magic field did not automatically decide a battle. The female student warned him that the attackers were seniors. The warning arrived too late as a powerful fire attack launched. Setsuna concentrated physical boost entirely into his legs. The enhancement sent him past the incoming fire at incredible speed. He flipped through the air without losing momentum. Setsuna landed lightly and continued moving toward the seniors. At that speed, he could dodge long-range magic instead of enduring it. The freedom made Setsuna eager to test the limit further. He teased the senior for using nothing except fireballs. The senior panicked because Setsuna's movements ruined his aim. Setsuna kept weaving so unpredictably that even he called the movement difficult to target. Frustration drove the senior to gather even more magical energy. He fired a concentrated beam, hoping raw power could end the chase. Setsuna answered by forming a blade of pure magical energy. The blade split the fire beam and left Setsuna untouched. The senior stared in disbelief because Setsuna had sliced through magic. A nearby student explained that higher magical proficiency wins direct clashes. Setsuna revealed that precise control, not overwhelming power, made him strongest before. Combining that control with close combat speed looked more useful than expected. The seniors tried to stop their leader before his reckless attack drew instructors. Anger silenced them, and the senior prepared an even larger spell. His desperate eye showed that the fight had become personal. A massive surge of magic exploded outward and blinded the courtyard. The senior realized too late that Setsuna had already reached him. Setsuna stood inside striking distance before the senior finished chanting. He named the technique Mana Fist and drove his blue aura forward. The punch launched the senior backward and announced Setsuna's next challenge, departmental exams. Setsuna opened the next lesson by dropping a blonde student with one mana-infused strike. The blonde student stared upward, shocked that close combat could hit so hard. Two witnesses watched in fear as Setsuna ended the fight instantly. Layla looked equally stunned because the result contradicted everything she believed. The defeated student stayed on the ground while Setsuna remained completely calm. Setsuna confirmed that close combat worked perfectly whenever an enemy entered his range. The blonde student demanded an explanation for magic labeled the Academy's weakest. Instead of humiliating him, Setsuna offered a hand and pulled him up. Intimidated by the difference in power, the student reluctantly accepted it. His friends helped him leave, still shaken by what Setsuna had shown. Setsuna then held out the small object taken during the fight. He asked Layla whether the item was important to her. Relief filled Layla's eyes when she realized the brooch was safe. She thanked Setsuna while clutching her mother's gift to her chest. Only then did Layla realize they had not properly introduced themselves. She gave him her full name, Layla Rosewill. Setsuna answered with his own name, Setsuna Cromwell. Layla recognized the famous genius and asked why he chose close combat. Setsuna said he needed it to defeat the evil god, though nobody would believe him. Layla suddenly remembered that department orientation had already started. The two hurried across campus toward the isolated department building. Its location at the campus edge proved how unpopular close combat had become. Layla asked Setsuna to teach her mana blade, but he credited simple mana control. Setsuna realized the path could adapt to many different combat situations. More importantly, mastering it might counter Vindrake's ability to dispel magic. Setsuna also needed another advantage against the evil god. That thought returned him to a meeting with the Academy's elderly headmaster. The headmaster removed his gloves and revealed glowing symbols on both hands. Setsuna focused on the seals because one of them was completely unfamiliar. The headmaster possessed two magic paths, something considered impossible under normal rules. Normally, a mage could choose only one path for an entire life. The right seal represented summoning magic, while the left remained a mystery. When Setsuna asked about it, the headmaster promised an explanation later. He decided to entrust Setsuna with the secret of that second magic. Layla's voice pulled Setsuna back when she pointed toward the department. They rushed the final distance before the orientation ended. Setsuna wondered how he could earn the headmaster's recognition this time. At the entrance, a bald professor waited with an openly hostile expression. He introduced himself while criticizing Setsuna for arriving late with a woman. Setsuna tried to explain, but the professor dismissed every excuse immediately. The professor warned that past achievements meant nothing inside this department. In his eyes, choosing close combat had already made Setsuna worthless. Setsuna grabbed his hand and challenged him to show pride in close combat. The professor blinked because students were not supposed to question him. Furious, he grabbed Setsuna by the collar. Setsuna calmly insisted that close combat still held undiscovered possibilities. The professor threatened to break his nose for speaking so confidently. Then he demanded that Setsuna prove those possibilities instead of talking. The training area contained black steel rocks for every student to attack. One student strained against his rock and prepared another useless strike. The impact landed, but the black steel did not even crack. The professor explained that extracting the embedded crystal was the first rank test. Around them, every student kept attacking without leaving a mark. The crystal had to be extracted quickly, turning strength into a timed requirement. The professor added one final rule. Anyone who failed would be punished. After an hour, nobody had broken through the black steel. The students blamed the rock's hardness because their learned magic was ineffective. Quiet gossip suggested the professor was angry about missing a promotion. He pointed Setsuna toward a much larger rock and called it a free target. Then he allowed only 10 minutes for Setsuna to reveal close combat's possibilities. Layla protested because their rock was larger and clearly more difficult. The professor ignored her and announced that 9 minutes already remained. Setsuna stepped forward and placed his hand against the massive black steel. He stood silently, focusing on the material beneath his palm. The cold surface revealed just how dense the challenge really was. The professor mistook Setsuna's silence for fear and offered more insults. Setsuna interrupted him with a shocking claim. 10 seconds was enough. The professor demanded to know whether Setsuna had lost his mind. Layla warned him that challenging the professor this way was reckless. The professor revealed that even he needed 30 minutes to break this density. He waited eagerly for Setsuna's promised failure. Setsuna accepted the challenge and let blue energy flood his hand. He needed to become the department's best before the headmaster would recognize him. Setsuna focused blue aura into his hand and prepared to prove close combat's value. He struck the dark stone at one precise point, instead of wasting power on its surface. A crack appeared exactly where Setsuna's mana entered the rock. The professor celebrated too early, and accused Setsuna of being all talk. Then the entire stone block shattered, proving his controlled hit had found its weakest point. Setsuna stood calmly among the debris, as if nothing unusual happened. The professor stared at the shattered block, unable to process 10 seconds. Setsuna held up the extracted purple crystal as proof. He reminded the professor that the promised 10 seconds were enough. The professor answered with another stunned silence. A female student whispered that Setsuna had truly done it. 2 others wondered whether he might be stronger than their professor. That possibility pushed the professor's disbelief toward pure frustration. He refused to recognize the result, and immediately called it cheating. According to him, even 10 minutes should not break such a rock. Setsuna mocked the professor and suggested returning to student status. The insult sent the professor searching for someone named Zakari. A massive hand grabbed the professor's head before his anger escalated. The newcomer asked whether he was bullying students again. The professor recognized head professor Lionel and immediately panicked. Lionel yawned and confirmed that Setsuna had not cheated. He explained that Setsuna read the mana flow inside the rock and used its weakness against it. Setsuna had simply aimed at the weakest point with perfect control. Lionel called the students together for an unexpected demonstration. The demonstration would reveal Professor Zakari's mana guard. Lionel warned that regular training should keep students alive through it. Zakari begged for mercy and promised not to bully anyone again. Lionel answered with one controlled punch surrounded by blue aura. The blow sent Zakari flying across the training hall. Setsuna recognized power that could break through mana guard instantly. Lionel approached him with a casual, cigar-chomping smile. He praised Setsuna and confirmed that the new student was no ordinary talent. The compliment was backhanded, but Lionel still encouraged him to continue. Setsuna accepted the attention without losing focus on his larger goal. He declared that close combat would not make him lose to other departments. Lionel smiled at the spirit behind that confident declaration. He even offered to teach Setsuna personally if needed. Walking away, Lionel realized someone finally shared his stubborn mindset. He saw Setsuna as an unexpected dark horse for the exchange match. Lionel turned back and prepared to introduce himself officially. He revealed that he was the department's head professor. Then Lionel announced that they would choose an exchange match representative. The event brought 8 magic departments together for honor and prestige. Each department would send one representative into a tournament, making victory valuable for public honor. Setsuna remembered winning that tournament as a long-range representative before regression. Fragments of black steel at his feet interrupted the memory. Lionel explained that another student had already passed the test. That student had extracted the crystal, using only his fists. Setsuna measured the distance and realized the fragments came from far away. Lionel called forward the student responsible, Drago Okrid. Drago questioned why Setsuna chose close combat despite every other aptitude. Setsuna answered that close combat had important work left to do. Drago mocked Setsuna's body and doubted he could survive this path. He had trained his close combat body for 17 years through family tradition and direct battle practice. Drago's focused eye made the challenge feel far more serious. Setsuna prepared calmly as mana gathered around his own eyes. The surrounding students recoiled when both auras suddenly erupted. Drago demanded a fight and refused to let a pretender represent them. Setsuna remembered Drago as the only famous fighter from this lowly department. He accepted the challenge with a calm smile. Lionel scheduled their match exactly 1 week later. He warned Setsuna not to escape and ordered a fight to the death. The students doubted Setsuna could overcome Drago's trained physique. One worried student asked Setsuna whether he could really win. Setsuna answered bluntly that winning was impossible in his current condition. He admitted that Drago's current body was physically impossible to match. Still, Setsuna promised a secret plan and walked away. He led the confused student into a secluded wooded area. She looked surprised, because the location was completely unfamiliar. An enormous ancient tree stood at the center of the forest. Setsuna revealed the tree as his secret training spot. Then green mana surrounded him, as he promised to become 3 times stronger. Drago stood before a sacred tree so massive it seemed older than the academy itself, perhaps more than 1,000 years old. The ancient sacred tree answered him with a sudden green glow that filled the forest. Drago smiled because the tree had acknowledged him again. Its holy blessing restored his mana and revealed a secret he had discovered before regression, giving him a major tactical advantage. As long as he stayed nearby, running out of mana was no longer a concern. That unlimited mana recovery gave Drago permission to train until reaching his absolute physical limit. Setsuna watched and recognized a natural-born close combat mage. Because Drago once helped retrieve her precious brooch, Setsuna decided it was her turn to help him now. She urged him to begin scouting, while Drago looked confused by her sudden energy. Their attention shifted back to the close combat department training room. Students lifted weights, while Setsuna watched one trainee struggle under a barbell. Then Setsuna noticed something so extreme that it stopped her conversation. One muscular student bench-pressed an absurd amount of weight, while everyone else watched in disbelief. Even the professor paused to watch the impossible training. He asked whether the student planned to crush every black steel rock outside. The student calmly replied that he would not break the rocks. He was only borrowing them while doing push-ups with the massive stack of black steel on his back. Setsuna wondered whether anyone could survive a punch from that kind of physically reinforced body. Worried by the training, she rushed back toward Drago. At the sacred tree, Drago sat reading with blue light glowing in his eyes. The book in his hands was titled The Book of Martial Arts. Setsuna demanded to know why he was relaxing instead of training. She described the student carrying 5 black steel rocks, and Drago said it was expected. Drago revealed that this strange preparation was part of his own plan. His glowing eye showed that reading was another form of focused training. He explained that physical boost reinforces and controls the nervous system with carefully directed mana. To strengthen a specific body part, a mage must focus mana directly into that part. The same principle could even boost memory by concentrating on the head. When the book closed, theory gave way to practical application. Drago reminded Setsuna that techniques only mattered after practice. His eyes sharpened as he directed mana through his body. A blue aura kick exploded forward with enough force to displace the air and nearby leaves across the clearing. Drago followed with fluid strikes that showed complete control of physical enhancement and close combat. Setsuna stared, because Drago's training looked far beyond ordinary practice. Even after impressive progress, Drago insisted that his current level was still nowhere near enough to win. He kept pushing until determination became visible pain. Then Drago collapsed and clutched his injured arm. Setsuna saw a strange glowing wound and immediately feared the worst. Drago insisted he was only pushing his muscles to their limit. Next, he focused mana on healing the damage he had caused himself. That method let him strengthen his body again in a short time. Setsuna begged him to stop, but Drago rejected every easier alternative without hesitation. He could not catch up to Drago with half-hearted training. His plan required repeating physical destruction and reconstruction 1,000 more times before the match, no matter how painful it became. As a child, Drago had grown up inside an orphanage. He could not use magic then, so every day became another lonely practice session. The small stone moved only after countless failures. Slow progress still counted, because Drago improved one step at a time. That difficult history taught him that pain was acceptable whenever it produced measurable strength. Now Drago and Setsuna trained together, matching high kicks beneath their mana auras. They struck heavy stone targets and pushed their close combat control further with every repeated movement. Setsuna realized people called Drago talented while ignoring the years of exhausting work behind that talent. Drago continued push-ups under a massive stack of black steel rocks. He counted through the strain and reached 10 repetitions. Setsuna finally admitted that Drago worked harder than anyone else around him, despite the rumors. A week later, the exchange match arena filled with spectators waiting for the department's representative. Drago's opponent expected him to run, but Drago refused because he represented close combat. He faced the other fighter without fear or hesitation. A bearded official raised his arm and asked whether both fighters were ready. Their auras collided while the arena held its breath. Drago entered his stance as the official finally started the match, beginning the test of all that preparation. Now every adjustment had to become real under pressure. Setsuna moved at full speed as the representative duel finally began. Drago attacked with overwhelming force, but Setsuna slipped outside the first strike. Blue mana trails followed every dodge as Drago refused to slow down. Drago swept across the arena while Setsuna carefully protected his distance. Setsuna realized that Drago had blocked every attack with Mana Guard. Drago reset his stance, still focused and ready to crush the defense. The difficulty of the match finally registered on Setsuna's face. Drago lunged again with enough mana to make the air shimmer. His frustrated roar showed that Setsuna's evasion was working. A heavy impact exploded across the arena and shook the spectators. Drago's kick landed with force, but Setsuna avoided its full damage. A nearby student shielded her eyes from the spreading shockwaves. She called Setsuna's name when Drago's attack became too dangerous. Drago continued the assault and filled the arena with dust. Setsuna remained defensive, using the dust to hide each narrow escape. The students wondered whether their newly promoted fighters had gone too far. Setsuna understood that one direct hit would end the fight. Drago pressed harder, trying to turn that danger into a guaranteed opening. Setsuna blocked while his body absorbed the growing strain. Drago raised another heavy strike and refused to let him breathe. The pressure pushed Setsuna backward across the arena. Drago's attacks became faster and stronger with every exchange. He taunted Setsuna for defending instead of fighting back. Setsuna stayed calm and prepared the counter hidden inside his defense. Drago claimed that Setsuna's weak body had reached its limit. Even the spectators began wondering whether training had been enough. From the side, an observer saw a fight more complicated than it looked. Setsuna appeared cornered, but the observer suspected a hidden strategy. Drago delivered another kick while Setsuna waited for the right reaction. Setsuna parried with precise mana control instead of meeting force with force. Drago grunted because another clean hit had slipped away. A spectator recognized that Setsuna was deflecting every attack through control. The fighters locked into close combat, their blue mana striking evenly. Drago accused the elites of looking down on close combat for years. Setsuna listened without losing his calm focus. Drago described the humiliation his close combat family had suffered. Mana crackled around his hand as resentment became a new source of power. Drago swore to change that fate with his own hands. He gripped the enormous mana blade formed from that resolve. Setsuna created his own blade and faced the stronger weapon calmly. His mana stayed steady because control mattered more than size. Both fighters dashed forward, leaving bright trails behind their blades. The blades collided and sent a burst of blue energy outward. Drago swung wide, forcing Setsuna to dodge rather than block. Setsuna landed cleanly and stayed ready for the next attack. Drago leaped high and prepared a crushing downward strike. Setsuna's eyes measured the attack and searched for its weakness. Drago hit the ground and cracked the arena with a mana explosion. He attacked again before the dust could settle. Setsuna stood inside the chaos with his mana blade prepared. Their blades clashed again, sending another shockwave across the floor. This time, Setsuna's hand trembled under the growing strain. Students mocked him for choosing close combat merely to stand out. Setsuna admitted he understood their words but refused their conclusion. He looked at Drago and revealed that their goals were bigger than this duel. The final clash locked both mana blades in a tense stalemate. Energy flared as each fighter pushed for the decisive advantage. Setsuna asked whether they were both aiming higher than this petty fight. Drago understood that Setsuna was pushing beyond simple victory. He attacked again, but Setsuna lowered his stance for a counter. Setsuna moved through the air with calm, superior agility. The wide arena finally showed Drago being pushed backward. Setsuna activated physical boost, acceleration. Drago raised both arms and desperately tried to block the incoming speed. His crossed arms absorbed the pressure, but the defense began failing. A watching student realized Setsuna's plan was actually working. The observer praised Drago's offense while calling Setsuna's control extraordinary. Setsuna knew Drago's defense was too hard and needed an opening. He leaped forward with his blade raised as Drago slid away. Drago charged mana into his hand for one final counterattack. He swung upward with a furious roar, trying to catch Setsuna in flight. He realized Drago was spending all his remaining mana on this attack. Drago's strike shattered the arena floor while Setsuna leaped away. Setsuna landed at the platform edge and discovered he had nowhere left to run. Drago celebrated because the corner removed Setsuna's proud footwork. His muscles tightened as he prepared one crushing final punch. A violent red and blue aura erupted around Drago's transformed body. Lapis stared in shock as the final power surge took shape. Drago raised his massive fist while Setsuna held his blade at the edge. The decisive punch launched toward Setsuna with all Drago's remaining strength. Drago's fist passed through empty air as Setsuna moved first. Drago stared at the afterimage and could not understand the dodge. Setsuna explained that leaving mana behind created a brief afterimage. He landed behind Drago with the mana blade already positioned. Drago pivoted in frustration, but his recovery came too late. Setsuna narrowed his eyes and declared that the fight was over. His blade swung toward Drago before the exhausted fighter could defend. Setsuna and Drago exchanged their final close combat attacks at full speed. Drago roared and poured everything into one last assault. The spectators watched the climax with wide, stunned eyes. The instructor recognized that both fighters had used smart counterattacks. He raised his hand and officially stopped the match. One student cheered while the rest stared at the unexpected result. Drago's trembling hand showed how much the final blow had cost him. He struggled to rise and wondered whether his body could stand again. The crowd agreed that Setsuna was far too tough to dismiss. Drago still could not believe the difference between them. Then, he realized Setsuna had adjusted the blade to avoid killing him. Setsuna offered his hand and helped Drago back to his feet. Drago asked the question that mattered more than the victory. What did Setsuna fight for? Setsuna looked down, preparing an answer he had carried since the battlefield. He fought to never lose again and stop anything precious from being taken. Then Setsuna promised to become stronger than anyone else. Drago's eye widened because that answer carried real conviction. He accepted the result and admitted that Setsuna was strong. Drago shook his hand and acknowledged that Setsuna deserved his reputation. He also sensed that Setsuna's power could help against the evil god. The instructor teased Drago for being a sore loser. Then he raised Setsuna's arm and announced his representative status. A few days later, the academy prepared the representatives' meeting. Setsuna walked with the instructor toward the face-to-face exchange match meeting. Outside the door, the instructor warned him to behave himself. Setsuna reached for the massive wooden door and entered alone. Inside, he calmly faced the representatives from every department. 3 female students watched him from a bench with open curiosity. A smug blonde representative mocked close combat as the lose combat department. He claimed Setsuna had entered only to expose his department's shame. The blonde boy called him a representative of the lowly grunt department. He stepped forward and stomped near Setsuna to establish dominance. The blonde stepped onto Setsuna's foot and poked his chest while grinning. He bragged that close combat had not won in 100 years. His arrogance vanished when sudden pressure froze his expression. Setsuna returned the greeting by crushing down on his foot. He calmly asked whether painful foot stomping was Enchantment's official greeting. Setsuna pressed harder until the blonde screamed. The boy glared upward, furious that his intimidation had reversed. Setsuna dismissed the 100-year streak and promised victory this year. The blonde pulled his foot away and stared at Setsuna's back. He shouted that Setsuna was talking nonsense. A dignified white boot entered the space between them. The headmaster calmly told them to settle the argument during the match. The other representatives watched the intervention in uneasy silence. Setsuna realized the meeting was unfolding exactly as it had before regression. The blonde finally identified the authority as the headmaster. All 8 representatives formed a respectful line before him. Carol cheerfully promised to show her abilities during the exchange match. Setsuna recognized her as Carol from the summoning department. In memory, Carol had ridden a massive white wolf into battle. The headmaster congratulated the 8 talents who earned representative rights. He began explaining details the departments had only discussed separately. The exchange match would use a one-on-one tournament with random opponents. Enchantment specialized in placing mana into objects and living targets. Its opponent was long range, which won by keeping enemies away. Carol's summoning could command mythical beasts from other worlds. The final match paired special magic against alchemy. Alchemy could permanently alter substances, making its representative dangerous. The headmaster gave them 10 days to train or rest before the tournament. He ended by saying he looked forward to their fighting spirit. Carol reacted with immediate excitement. The representatives bowed as the headmaster prepared to leave. Setsuna realized this was his only chance to speak with him privately. He followed the headmaster through the echoing hall. Setsuna called out, forcing the headmaster to turn around. The headmaster recognized him as the close combat representative. Setsuna introduced himself and said he had a request. If he won, Setsuna wanted the headmaster to teach him his magic. He clarified that he meant the headmaster's other magic, not summoning. The headmaster's expression changed from calm to immediate suspicion. He stared intensely at Setsuna, searching for the source of that knowledge. Setsuna realized he might have exposed too much about the future. The headmaster released a powerful aura that made the entire hall vibrate with danger. Setsuna understood that the warning had become a direct challenge. The headmaster demanded to know how Setsuna knew about his secret magic. The pressure around him was overwhelming, proving the headmaster was already wary. Setsuna still believed that second magic could become humanity's hope against Vindrake. He refused to back down after finally reaching this opportunity. Setsuna admitted he could not explain everything, but kept arguing for victory. A close combat championship after a century could overturn the world's common sense. Setsuna asked the headmaster to hope for that impossible change. The corridor held both men in a tense standoff. The headmaster studied Setsuna's unwavering eye before answering. He suspected Setsuna was scheming something beyond a tournament victory. Still, the headmaster agreed to teach the second magic if Setsuna won the championship. Setsuna bowed and thanked him for accepting the condition. The headmaster warned that this would not be an easy path. Setsuna promised to show victory regardless of the difficulty. The headmaster approved of that spirit and ended the conversation. 10 years after regression, ordinary school life still felt strangely boring. Even a recommended piece of bread tasted exciting compared with the battlefield. With 10 days left, Setsuna knew every spare moment needed preparation. A dark fist suddenly swung at him from the side. Setsuna blocked the rocky attack with a burst of blue mana. The attacker was a stone golem that he stopped in the courtyard. A glasses-wearing student admitted he planned to strike from a blind spot. Setsuna questioned what kind of behavior he was witnessing. The student called it a continuation of their previous confrontation. He raised his hand and summoned more rocks for another attack. Humiliation had convinced him that a close combat student deserved punishment. Setsuna answered that the ambush was simply the consequence of his actions. Several stone golems surrounded Setsuna and prepared to attack together. The student suddenly worried that bullying Setsuna might become a reportable problem. He crumbled the golems and ended the failed ambush. Walking away, he promised to be more prepared for the tournament match. Setsuna recognized talent in controlling matter, but disliked the student's character. What bothered him most was the bread dropped during the pointless attack. The next day, the instructor began preparing them for the exchange match. He asked Setsuna and Drago to name the weaknesses from their last fight. Drago admitted he had lost control of both mana and emotion. The instructor called recognizing weakness the first step toward growth. A student asked whether this match would serve as tournament training. The instructor revealed that Noel from Enchantment was their first opponent. Noel could control multiple golems as both weapons and shields. Because golems had physical bodies, their fighting style resembled close combat. Drago would imitate several golems by attacking Setsuna from every angle. Drago promised that this practice would not repeat their last match. Setsuna smiled because another difficult test was exactly what he needed. The two faced each other and prepared for the training match. Blue mana gathered around their hands as the exercise began. Setsuna opened with a quick strike to test Drago's defense. Drago slid back and prepared a counterattack with improved timing. Their mana-infused fists collided and started the real exchange. Drago smiled because he finally enjoyed the rhythm of the fight. Setsuna realized the speed increase had caught him off guard. Drago landed a clean strike against his guard. Setsuna identified reaction speed as the weakness he needed to fix. The instructor praised Drago for balancing speed and power. Drago kept pressing forward while controlling the match. Setsuna threw a powerful punch and tested the new defense. Drago predicted a left hook before Setsuna could complete it. Setsuna realized the first movement had been a deliberate feint. The instructor told him to step away and counter instead of blocking. Setsuna used a sharp mana-enhanced step to escape. His counter connected cleanly against Drago's guard. Setsuna stayed focused as the practice pushed him harder. By the end, Setsuna was breathing heavily from the exchange. Drago called it a good match while both fighters recovered. The instructor predicted they could handle 4 or 5 golems soon. He still warned them never to drop their guard. The instructor admired how quickly Setsuna absorbed every command. At last, the exchange match arena opened before the crowd. The 781st Elm Ridge Magic Academy exchange match was about to begin. Representatives from all 8 departments gathered for the competition. The headmaster watched from a prominent seat above the arena. The crowd wondered which representative would claim the strongest title. One student backed Setsuna and called him the Dark Horse. The crowd noticed relaxed Actor from the long-range department. Actor expected to face the winner of this opening match. The commentator announced that the battle stage changed randomly each time. This time, the arena transformed into a vast desert. A mysterious figure smiled because the desert was exactly what he wanted. Students cheered for Noel and mocked the close combat underdog. An orange-haired student demanded they watch whether Setsuna was truly an underdog. Setsuna answered her confidence with a calm smile. A raised hand signaled the start of the opening match. The commentator shouted for the exchange match to begin. The signal finally sounded, and the first exchange match began beneath a stadium full of watching students. Across the sand, the opposing caster raised a jagged black rock as if he had already found the perfect shortcut to victory. Setsuna calmly identified it as black steel, refusing to let the opponent's dramatic entrance shake him. The fragment sank into the sand and fused with it, revealing the real trick. This rock was a core for summoning golems. Mana rippled through the arena as sand and black steel twisted upward into the first massive construct. Its rough hand alone looked heavy enough to crush a fighter, and the new golem was only getting started. The black steel giant stood with red eyes glowing, while its creator boasted that even a blade could not scratch it. Then the caster pulled out more fragments, making it clear that one golem was merely the opening act. Multiple points across the desert erupted as the spell spread, and new golems began rising around Setsuna. With black steel bodies filling the arena, the opponent proudly reduced Setsuna's chance of winning to practically nothing. The golems advanced together, their red eyes fixed on Setsuna like a walking wall of bad news. One stone face pushed close with a silent promise that the swarm intended to finish the match quickly. Even the spectators started asking how many of these things could possibly exist at the same time. The answer was worse. As long as sand covered the stage, the opponent claimed he could keep making golems forever. Students in the stands treated the result as settled and advised the close combat representative to surrender. The caster offered Setsuna one last chance to say something before the golems finished him off. Setsuna stood alone in front of the swarm, and that calm posture made the opponent pause to see what he would do. Instead of panicking, Setsuna called the entire strategy boring and admitted he had expected a better trump card. That single insult wiped the confidence off the opponent's face and replaced it with instant outrage. He stopped talking and ordered every golem to overwhelm Setsuna at once. The constructs charged across the sand while Setsuna held his ground in the center of their attack pattern. Their collision detonated into a storm of dust and broken stone, swallowing the fighter everyone had just mocked. The caster laughed like the match was already over, proudly celebrating a victory no one had confirmed. The spectators could not even see through the dust, so the arena had become a giant suspense machine. Inside the cloud, the golems kept crashing forward, their heavy bodies turning the hidden battle into pure chaos. Then a flash cut through the dust, revealing Setsuna slicing through the constructs with a blade of concentrated mana. He emerged among the wreckage and announced that he had already mastered the black steel rock's weakness. The opponent stared at the destroyed golems, his confidence collapsing faster than the stone bodies around him. Desperate to recover control, he kept summoning more constructs and insisted that unlimited numbers had to win eventually. Setsuna answered that close-range magic was strongest in close quarters, especially against enemies trapped in repetitive patterns. He drove a precise burst of magic into the ground, turning the next attack into a clean opening instead of a blind exchange. Setsuna slipped between the golems with smooth footwork, his glowing blade carving through their defenses before they could surround him. The dense black steel offered no resistance to his technique, proving that raw toughness meant nothing against the right angle. He launched himself above the last construct and gathered all that momentum into one decisive downward strike. The blade crashed down in a blinding flash, shattering the golem's defenses before it could lift an arm. The opponent watched another construct fall, and finally understood that every new golem only gave Setsuna another target. Panic took over as he desperately tried to control the remaining resources and stop the match from slipping away. But Setsuna had already crossed the distance, moving so quickly that the summoner barely had time to react. The counterstrike landed with crushing force, and Setsuna calmly called the fight unfair for the man who had created the trap. The full impact drove the opponent backward, ending his golem army and leaving him with nothing but a pained gasp. When the dust opened, Setsuna stood victorious while the defeated caster lay among the ruins of his supposedly invincible army. For a few seconds, the spectators still stared into the dust, waiting for the arena to reveal which fighter remained. As the cloud dispersed, the crowd finally saw Setsuna standing alone and realized the underdog had rewritten the result. The official announcement confirmed Setsuna as the winner, stunning everyone who had expected the close combat department to fold. Setsuna accepted the victory with a calm smile, treating the impossible first win as the beginning rather than the finish. A student in the stands cheered for him, proof that one clean performance could change the room's entire mood. Other students wondered how long it had been since close combat last won a match, as if they were watching a historical glitch. They tried to explain the result through output limits and self-destruction, but none of those theories matched what Setsuna had done. Some skeptics still called it luck, because admitting skill would mean their entire view of close combat was wrong. A mustached observer could only grind his teeth while the upset victory ruined the prediction he wanted everyone to believe. Another observer admitted the defeat was not self-destruction and began paying serious attention to Setsuna. A long purple-haired student watched from the shadows and called Setsuna interesting enough to catch his eye. That smile carried no congratulations. It carried a warning that some kind of insurance was already being prepared. The arena reset for the second match, but Setsuna's victory had already become the event everyone was discussing. While Setsuna walked through the stands, a student congratulated him and asked whether he would stay for the next battle. Setsuna agreed, hoping the next match could give him a useful reference for future close combat fights. The next contest featured Carol from summoning against a formation magic representative, who was already under pressure. Carol rode a huge purple-furred beast into the arena and directed it forward with blue energy trailing from her command. Her opponent planted glowing magic circles across the ground and tried to close the distance before the beast could overwhelm him. He moved from circle to circle under pressure, turning every step into a desperate attempt to create a safer position. Leo studied those movements from the stands and wondered whether the same tactical footwork could work in close-quarters combat. Sitting beside Leo, Setsuna admitted that other magic paths looked impressive, but he still wanted to grow stronger through close combat. When Leo asked why, Setsuna explained that a close combat mage had once saved her and changed the direction of her life. The memory returned to a forest where young Setsuna and her little brother ran from a grizzly bear with nowhere to hide. Just before fear became hopelessness, a mysterious figure rushed into the scene with blue energy blazing around him. The close combat mage met the bear head-on and dropped it with one powerful punch, saving both children. Back in the stands, Setsuna's eyes filled with tears as she admitted that rescue became her dream of helping others. She worried the reason sounded childish, as if one moment from childhood could not justify an entire future. Leo immediately rejected that idea and told her that the dream was not childish at all. He added that anyone who carried a real goal in their heart could keep getting stronger, and Setsuna listened closely. The encouragement made Setsuna blush and stumble over her reply before a new voice interrupted the moment. A blonde student approached them with an easy greeting and called Leo by name as though they had known each other for years. He introduced himself as Leo Fair Elmcrest and mentioned that he had been second only to Leo in the long-range department. Leo Fair praised Setsuna's first match performance, then immediately turned the compliment into a teasing question about the girl beside him. Setsuna panicked at the implication and tried to correct him while Leo Fair enjoyed every second of the misunderstanding. Leo insisted he was only Setsuna's friend, then stood up and decided to leave the two of them alone for a while. Once the teasing ended, Leo Fair reminded Leo that he had not expected him to skip the long-ranged representative spot. He warned Setsuna to be careful with Akhtar, whose dirty moves were dangerous enough to fool even him. Leo Fair admitted that Akhtar had tricked him and stolen the representative position, leaving the frustration fresh in his voice. Leo listened without interrupting, narrowing his eyes as the cheerful conversation turned into a serious warning. He understood that Akhtar was the type to do anything for a win, so lowering his guard would be a serious mistake. Elsewhere, a memory showed two children playing freely in a lavish hallway before the mood shifted again. The purple-haired observer opened a chest and revealed a bouquet of flowers, a strangely gentle object in dangerous hands. Then the observer smirked down at the flowers, making the soft gesture feel less like a gift and more like a threat waiting to bloom. The second round opened with long range facing close combat, which sounded less like a fair match and more like an official ambush. Then the arena exploded into jagged rock, revealing that the stage itself had been chosen to make approaching the enemy miserable. They called it the Scorching Hell, where one wrong step off the platform meant instant defeat above molten lava. An observer immediately pointed out the obvious: a close combat fighter had to cross a death zone just to reach the opponent. The head of the long-range department did not even pretend the advantage was accidental, proudly calling the cheating effortless. He promised to make Setsuna regret choosing close combat, as though the entire stage had been built for that exact lesson. Before the match could begin, Setsuna sat with Layla and warned her not to touch a vase resting nearby. The vase was a contact-triggered magic tool designed to drain mana, meaning one curious hand could empty a fighter before the fight even started. Layla demanded to know who had planted it, and Setsuna calmly explained that it was already the 7th trap aimed at him. 7 traps finally made Layla ask whether Setsuna was actually all right or merely pretending to be. Setsuna had avoided them so far, but he was certain Akhtar was responsible because the long-range fighter was clever enough to leave no evidence. A knock interrupted the deduction, turning everyone's attention toward the door before the next trap could announce itself. 3 children stood outside holding flowers and cheerfully presented the bouquet to their big brother. They said someone nearby had asked them to deliver it, which made the innocent gift feel suspiciously well-timed. Setsuna looked down the hallway, but the sender had vanished before anyone could ask a single question. Layla wondered if the sender was a shy fan of Setsuna, unaware that the bouquet had been delivered with a much darker purpose. The flowers suddenly slipped from the children's hands, and the harmless-looking gift became the center of a rapidly unfolding disaster. One child grabbed their head as dizziness hit, while a dark aura gathered around their body. A bruised mark appeared on the child's neck, giving Setsuna a warning he had seen many times before. His battlefield memories returned instantly, and he recognized the mark as a poison symptom from the years before his regression. Setsuna kicked the bouquet away, cutting off the source before the toxin could spread to everyone in the room. He identified the poison as venenum, a poisonous grass strong enough to become irreversible without immediate treatment. The children kept coughing, and their small voices made the urgency impossible to ignore. Setsuna and Layla rushed to support them as all 3 children began showing signs of the poison. Fury replaced Setsuna's tournament focus when he realized Akhtar had dragged children into their rivalry and left them minutes from permanent harm. The problem was that finding a healer who could treat venenum on such short notice would be nearly impossible. Layla confirmed that the children's condition was critical, and the room suddenly felt too small for the time they had left. Setsuna warned Layla to stay back because the poison might infect anyone who remained too close to it. Fear reflected in Layla's eye, but she did not retreat from the children who needed her. She forced herself to believe everything would be fine, even while the poison was proving the opposite. Then Layla stepped forward with a green magic tool and ordered Setsuna to leave the children to her. Setsuna recognized the artifact from an earlier memory, a device capable of storing mana for exactly this kind of emergency. Layla recalled that her mother had embedded healing magic inside it, and her expression hardened around that last chance. She knelt beside the unconscious children and released a vivid green aura that spread across all 3 bodies. The dark mark on one child's neck began to fade, and a weak sound proved the healing magic was reaching them. Setsuna watched the spots disappear and finally allowed himself a breath of relief. Layla admitted she had received the tool as an emergency gift, then decided that 3 poisoned children absolutely qualified. Setsuna thanked her, knowing that her quick decision had bought the children the time he needed to stop the poison itself. He seized the bouquet as a blue aura gathered around it, turning from rescue to disposal in the same motion. Setsuna sprinted away and promised to handle the poisonous grass before it could endanger another person. The venenum began releasing a dark mist, and Setsuna realized the blooming flowers were becoming more toxic by the second. He could not destroy it in a crowd because the scattered toxin would turn innocent spectators into the next victims. The bouquet kept shedding poison as he ran, shrinking the distance between a controlled solution and a public disaster. The toxin reached Setsuna's neck, and pain tightened his expression without slowing his search for somewhere isolated. At last he found a solitary tree far from the crowd and decided it was the only safe place left. The flowers decayed rapidly in his grip, pouring out a thick black cloud that demanded immediate action. Setsuna threw the bouquet into the air and prepared to strike the entire threat before the cloud could travel farther. He leaped after it with blue mana flooding his hand, committing everything to one explosive counterattack. The attack tore out of him with a strained cry as poison, exhaustion, and urgency collided in the same instant. Blue energy ripped through the bouquet and scattered the flowers, cutting the poison source apart. A cleansing green light filled the area around the tree, confirming that the toxic cloud had finally been neutralized. With the children safe and the poison destroyed, Setsuna collapsed under the physical cost of arriving late to his own match. Back at the arena, the announcer asked where the close combat representative was, while the crowd waited for a fight that had not started. Some spectators guessed Setsuna had run away, turning his absence into another rumor before anyone knew the truth. The designated time passed, and the announcer prepared to declare Setsuna a forfeit and Actor the winner. A voice shouted for them to wait, interrupting the announcement before the rigged victory could become official. The purple-haired observer turned toward the entrance, suddenly alert as if he had sensed the missing fighter's return. Setsuna finally appeared, disheveled and marked by poison, but still standing between Actor and the victory he wanted. He refused to forfeit and challenged Actor to fight, proving that the poison had damaged his body but not his resolve. Actor answered with a sinister grin and mocked the condition Setsuna had dragged into the arena. Setsuna and Actor faced each other across the rocky arena, with lava glowing below every narrow path between them. Setsuna taunted Actor about the congratulatory gift from the first round, making it sound less like kindness and more like a trap being sprung. Actor confronted him over the poison affecting innocent children, proving that the match had already become personal. Setsuna answered with fake surprise, pretending poison had nothing to do with him while the arena filled with tension. Actor stayed furious, and the exchange of names made it clear neither fighter intended to soften the next attack. The taunting mage pushed the cruelty further, claiming even the children should be happy to serve the elite. Purple veins marked Actar's poisoned body as he roared his own name and prepared to fight through the damage. The announcer finally called the second round, giving the two rivals permission to turn their argument into violence. Setsuna opened with Storm Ballet, a golden spell circle forming around his hand before a storm of magic crossed the arena. Actar dodged the first barrage, but the poison made every movement look tighter and more expensive than it should have been. Spectators noticed the rough quality of Actar's mana and assumed the poison had ruined his ability to fight properly. Actar knew the sacred tree had purified part of the venenum, but there had not been enough time to clear the poison inside him. He kept moving through the incoming projectiles, relying on strained reflexes to stay ahead of the spell pattern. One blast finally caught him and hurled him through the air, giving Setsuna the opening he had been waiting for. Setsuna shouted that the fight was not over, and continued pressing forward before Actar could recover. Actar was forced backward across the rocks, struggling to keep his footing while the magical barrage refused to let up. From the stands, the announcer declared that the close combat fighter was completely on defense. A mustached observer watched with smug satisfaction, convinced that the earlier preparation had already decided the result. The same observer looked toward the arena and promised Setsuna a humiliation that would last beyond this match. Even while surrounded by attacks, Actar worried about Layla and hoped the poisoned children were safe. Setsuna laughed through another spell and asked whether something was bothering Actar, clearly enjoying the distraction. Actar could only pant as the poison, and repeated evasions drained whatever strength remained in his body. The crowd mistook his movement for panic, and concluded that close combat had no answer for a long-range opponent. Setsuna offered a withdrawal with a laugh, treating Actar's exhausted state like proof that the fight was already finished. Actar refused and raised a mana guard, choosing to absorb the next storm instead of giving Setsuna the surrender he wanted. The barrier shook under the barrage, and Actar grunted as every impact pushed his defense closer to failure. From behind, the glowing mana guard looked solid, but the strain running through Actar's stance told a different story. A single drop of blood reached the ground, proving that even the guard could not stop the damage completely. Cuts covered Actar's body, yet his eyes remained focused enough to keep searching for the one opening Setsuna had missed. Setsuna laughed and pointed at the wounds, convinced that his opponent was finally falling apart. But Actar's eye sharpened instead of fading, revealing that the exhaustion had been hiding calculation rather than surrender. He stood inside the dust and asked why Setsuna still had not finished him, turning the taunt back toward its owner. Actar had already understood the plan. Keep him away from close combat and bury him beneath consecutive long-range attacks. What he could not understand was why Setsuna had spent so much time provoking him instead of taking the obvious finishing shot. Setsuna answered by telling Actar to look around, finally revealing that the real battlefield was not the distance between them. Actar stood alone on a thin rock pillar above the lava, with nowhere left to move without risking instant defeat. A spectator wondered when Actar had been pushed onto that pillar, because the trap had been built silently beneath the spell exchanges. Setsuna explained that he avoided unnecessary risks and had guided the entire fight toward this position from the beginning. He raised his hand and formed Storm Cannon, intending to end the duel while Actar was trapped above the lava. The observers tensed at the sight of the spell, realizing that one direct hit could erase the pillar and the fighter standing on it. Setsuna declared the match over and released Storm Cannon as the crowd screamed his name over the expanding blast. Actar looked toward the stands and noticed someone holding a familiar magic artifact, changing relief into a new idea. Layla raised the artifact and shouted that the children were safe, removing the worry that had been weakening Akhtar's focus. Akhtar smiled because he could finally stop fighting for time and start fighting only for the result. He breathed out in relief, certain that the children were no longer trapped inside the poison's deadline. A blue aura gathered around Akhtar as he steadied himself on the pillar and prepared the comeback. Setsuna thought impossible. Akhtar announced that it was time for his comeback, and the confidence in his voice made the lava stage feel suddenly smaller. Setsuna stared in shock as Akhtar recovered, unable to understand how a poisoned fighter could still be standing. Akhtar revealed the answer. Physical boost had activated his cells throughout the fight, gradually breaking down the poison. While Setsuna focused on the attacks, Akhtar had been chipping away at the pillar's footing and quietly preparing the reversal. Setsuna panicked and demanded to know what Akhtar could possibly do from that impossible position. A supporter in the stands recognized the plan and shouted for Akhtar to finish it. The answer arrived as a massive whirlwind caught Setsuna and lifted him away from the ground. Energy twisted around the arena, leaving Setsuna suspended while the lava opened beneath the collapsing footing. Akhtar admitted his magical power was nearly gone, but with no footing left, this final attack was still enough. He gathered the last of his energy into one decisive strike and aimed it through the center of the storm. Akhtar's face tightened with concentration as he forced every remaining fragment of power into the finishing move. The strike landed in a web of crackling energy, turning the arena's final exchange into a flash of pure force. Akhtar swept his glowing blade through the air, sending a huge arc of light across the lava-filled pit. Setsuna's expression broke into disbelief as the attack he expected to finish Akhtar was suddenly being pushed back. A spectator shouted that Akhtar had repelled the attack, and the crowd finally understood that the battle had reversed. The backlash caught Setsuna and dragged a scream from him as the control he had fought for disappeared. A huge explosion swallowed the center of the arena, reducing both fighters to silhouettes above a collapsing sea of energy. Akhtar emerged through the dust and asked whether Setsuna had really believed he could not nullify his own magic. He leaped across the remaining gap with his blade glowing, turning the word over into a promise instead of a prediction. Akhtar asked whether Setsuna had thought a distance like this could protect him from a close combat fighter forever. Setsuna stared in horror as the last escape vanished, and denial became the only answer he could manage. Akhtar's blade cut through the air and struck Setsuna, leaving blood across the final exchange. The fallen fighter could no longer answer as Akhtar stood over him and the arena announced Setsuna Cromwell as the winner. Two observers celebrated the result from the stands, satisfied that the unexpected turn had delivered the outcome they wanted. Another spectator stared wide-eyed, realizing the match had not ended with the final strike at all. The rock pillar beneath Akhtar began cracking, proving that the battlefield itself had been damaged beyond recovery. Spectators pointed toward the arena and shouted for everyone to wait as the ground started to give way. The pillar collapsed completely, sending Akhtar and Setsuna falling together into the lava pit below. The arena vanished above Setsuna as the collapsing stage sent him toward a fiery pit beneath the bright sky. Rock and lava rushed closer, turning the end of the match into a fall with no safe landing in sight. Then Setsuna spotted Akhtar unconscious in the air and reached for him before the lava could claim them both. He caught Akhtar's leg at the last possible moment, but holding one exhausted fighter while falling was not exactly a long-term plan. With no path left, Setsuna called for Fenrir and trusted Carol's summoning magic to solve the problem he had created by surviving. Carol answered from above, her face tightening as she poured summoning power into the rescue. Fenrir appeared beneath them like a living bridge and caught both fighters before the lava could finish the tournament. Setsuna recognized Carol's summoning magic and realized that her timing had saved his life as much as Akhtar's. The spectators erupted into cheers because the impossible fall had somehow become a dramatic rescue instead of a double defeat. Fenrir's paw struck the ground with enough force to announce that the beast had landed and the danger was finally over. Carol patted Fenrir while medics attended to the unconscious Akhtar, and Setsuna stood nearby trying to process the last minute. Carol smiled from Fenrir's back and teased Setsuna about surviving at least one part of the situation without her help. She added that Setsuna had looked capable enough to handle the crisis alone, which was generous considering the lava. Setsuna gave her the honest answer. She had rescued him, and pretending otherwise would be ridiculous. The announcer praised Carol as a stylish championship contender whose talent made her a serious threat to everyone remaining. Setsuna watched Carol and decided that if she kept winning, he would need to prepare for a brutal future battle against her. The crowd noticed that the close combat representative had won again and began asking whether the first victory had really been luck. One student stared at the money he had lost, learning the painful difference between confidence and a reliable bet. Another spectator realized that continued success would make Setsuna's run completely unprecedented. An elderly man watched from his elevated chair and quietly recognized that something important was happening in the arena. A furious mustached observer glared at the aftermath, his expression making it obvious that Setsuna's success had ruined more than one plan. He pointed toward the arena and vowed never to forget what Setsuna Cromwell had done to him. Friends met Setsuna in the stands, congratulated him, and admitted that Layla had already told them how difficult the match became. Setsuna ignored the praise and immediately asked about the children who had been poisoned. His friends reassured him that the children were sleeping in the infirmary and that the doctor expected them to recover soon. Only then did Setsuna relax, relieved that the poison had not taken the victory he was actually fighting to protect. That relief vanished when Setsuna sensed something cold moving through the tournament grounds. He lowered his gaze and focused, trying to understand what kind of threat could carry that much silent pressure. A pair of boots stood over a faint purple glow, suggesting that the ominous presence was already moving somewhere nearby. Setsuna returned to the seating area, but the crowded academy could not distract him from the danger he had just felt. Layla asked whether something was wrong, and Setsuna answered no, even though his tense expression said otherwise. He kept wondering what that cold sensation had been, because it carried an unmistakable intent to kill. Dark energy swirled around the tournament arena, giving the structure itself the look of something hiding a second contest. Later, Setsuna tested his power in a forest clearing and left smoke rising from the rocks in front of him. With the final match only a week away, he admitted that ordinary strength would not be enough to oppose the mysterious presence. Setsuna stepped into the grass and decided that the power he needed belonged to one specific close combat master. He met a muscular professor in a remote spot and asked why the man had called him there, already knowing the answer he wanted. Setsuna respectfully requested the professor's guidance again, trading tournament urgency for a chance at real instruction. Then he used the legendary title directly, Fist of Comet Lionel. Lionel reacted with surprise because that nostalgic name had not been spoken to him in a very long time. Setsuna clenched his fist and confirmed that Lionel was exactly the professor he had been searching for. He explained that the Magic Corps had spoken about Lionel before Setsuna's regression, preserving knowledge from a future Lionel never saw. A flashback showed Lionel in his prime, dropping even ferocious dragons with a single close combat blow. Setsuna admitted he had been thinking about Lionel's power since their first contact, but he still struggled to ask for it. Finally, he bowed and asked Lionel to teach him the magic that had earned the title Fist of Comet. Lionel smiled and remembered how long it had been since anyone called him that. Setsuna brushed the nostalgia aside and declared Lionel the strongest close combat mage he had ever encountered. Lionel asked why Setsuna needed that level of power when he was already strong enough to impress the academy. Setsuna answered that being strong enough was not the same as being strong enough to never lose. He added that he refused to lose, even if the opponent standing across from him was a god. Lionel narrowed his eyes, measuring whether that ambition came from arrogance or a reason much more dangerous. A small smile appeared at the corner of Lionel's mouth as he reached his decision. He laughed and admitted that Setsuna was interesting enough to deserve an answer. Lionel agreed to teach him, though he warned that the technique was normally too dangerous for a growing student's body. He raised one fist and began gathering blue mana, giving Setsuna a first look at the power he had requested. Setsuna felt immense mana collecting in that fist and understood why one strike had made Lionel a legend. Lionel unleashed the Fist of Comet, cracking the ground with a massive blue blast while explaining its enormous mana cost. He told Setsuna that one shot was enough and demanded total attention while the technique was still visible. The pressure forced Setsuna to shield his face as debris and mana tore through the training ground. The shockwave kept spreading, demonstrating that the technique was not a punch so much as a controlled natural disaster. When the dust settled, Lionel stood calmly inside a crater, large enough to make the lesson impossible to misunderstand. Setsuna stared at the crater and could only admit that the power was beyond anything he had expected. Lionel explained that constant mana gathering made the technique difficult to use in a one-on-one tournament, then asked if Setsuna still wanted it. Setsuna accepted the limitation and told Professor Lionel he was counting on him. Lionel agreed to start training immediately and ordered Setsuna to follow him. Elsewhere, a pink-haired woman sat calmly in a luxurious room with tea in hand, far from the crater and the tournament noise. She congratulated someone on reaching the finals, keeping her voice friendly while the next match quietly approached. The woman asked how confident her companion felt against a close combat opponent. A relaxed answer dismissed victory and defeat as matters of luck, promising only to give the match a proper effort. She offered another cup of tea, maintaining an ordinary hospitality that made the hidden danger harder to notice. When she stood to serve it, the calm room briefly looked harmless again. Then a hand revealed a mysterious card or item, and the conversation changed before anyone could pretend it was ordinary. The pink-haired woman's expression snapped from courtesy to shock the instant she saw what had been presented. She gasped as the meaning of the card reached her, suddenly aware that the final match carried a hidden price. A glowing mark appeared on the back of her neck, linking her body to the mysterious object in a way that felt supernatural. She collapsed while a voice accepted the possibility of her winning, as long as the situation did not change first. The final glimpse revealed an eye burning with fire, warning that the quiet threat around the tournament had just awakened. The academy grounds looked peaceful under the bright sky, which was impressive considering Setsuna had just turned part of them into a crater. A clenched fist surrounded by energy hinted that the destruction had been training, not an actual attack on the academy. Setsuna stood inside the crater, breathing hard and asking Lionel whether he had finally performed the technique correctly. Lionel admitted that he never expected Setsuna to memorize the entire method in less than a week when it had taken him years. Then Lionel corrected the name. Setsuna had not learned the Fist of Comet itself, but its more practical cousin, Charge Bullet. Setsuna smiled anyway, because a new weapon was still a new weapon and the final match was already waiting. The 781st Elm Ridge Magic Academy Exchange Final finally arrived, bringing the entire academy into one roaring arena. The commentator raised the microphone and turned the crowd's excitement into an official announcement. First came Carol, the overwhelming favorite from the undefeated summoning department. Then the announcer introduced Setsuna, the rising close combat underdog who had already embarrassed several predictions. Students argued over the winner before either fighter had even moved. Most of them backed the undefeated summoning department, because betting against a perfect record felt like volunteering for disappointment. A new fan defended Setsuna and admitted that the close combat department had become impossible to ignore. Other students joined in, cheering for Setsuna like he was already the academy's favorite older brother. The stage was revealed as the Ruins of the Goddess, a battlefield of ancient stone built for a final worthy of the name. Formation mages raised a powerful barrier around the arena so the coming battle would not turn the audience into collateral damage. From the stands, Lionel noted that the ruins finally offered Setsuna a stage without an obvious disadvantage. Setsuna stood in the arena and focused, letting the noise fade until only the opponent in front of him remained. He reminded the headmaster that a victory meant receiving the promised second magic, and he had no intention of losing now. The headmaster watched without changing expression, as if he wanted Setsuna to prove the promise before claiming it. Carol greeted Setsuna from across the ruins and noticed that he looked far too confident for an underdog. She summoned Fenrir beside her and wished Setsuna luck, though the giant wolf made the word feel politely dangerous. The anticipated final began, and the entire arena leaned forward for the first exchange. Carol called Fenrir into the fight, releasing the wolf-like familiar in a burst of summoning energy. Fenrir's eyes met Setsuna's, and the stare between them made the size difference feel like a personal insult. The familiar launched a freezing attack that forced Setsuna to dodge before he could build any momentum. Setsuna identified the cold as blizzard-like magic and immediately understood that standing still would be fatal. Carol praised his footwork but warned that she would not allow even a second of rest. Riding Fenrir, she kept the freezing barrage moving and turned every dodge into another step away from her. Setsuna answered by activating physical boost times 10, pushing his body into a speed the ice could not easily track. He slipped through a storm of sharp ice projectiles, leaving blue trails behind every evasive movement. Then Setsuna took to the air with his mana blade glowing, and finally began closing the distance to Fenrir. Fenrir answered with a gigantic claw swipe, but Setsuna twisted past it by a margin so narrow the crowd could feel the danger. A student shouted that Setsuna had done it, celebrating the first time the close combat fighter reached the favorite. Lionel explained that summoned beasts were condensed mana, which meant Fenrir's body could be damaged without being permanently defeated. Carol touched Fenrir and confirmed the problem herself. Any wound the familiar received would heal almost instantly. She praised Fenrir as a strong boy, while the beast kept Setsuna moving and refused to let him turn one opening into a victory. Carol smiled like a predator and admitted that Setsuna had done well, which usually meant the comfortable part of the fight was over. Fenrir howled, and a wave of freezing energy swept across the ruins until the entire arena began changing beneath Setsuna's feet. Ice formed under Setsuna's boot, turning every step into a balance test with a very cold failure condition. He looked around and realized the stage itself had become Carol's weapon. The ruins froze from edge to edge, leaving Setsuna small and exposed, while Carol and Fenrir waited across the white battlefield. Setsuna understood that the barrier had trapped the freezing mana inside the arena, intensifying the cold instead of letting it disperse. Lionel confirmed the danger. On a frozen stage, Fenrir's attacks would become even stronger. His eye sharpened as he wondered what Setsuna could possibly do against a battlefield designed to reward the summon from every angle. Setsuna reached the same conclusion from inside the ice. An endurance battle was disastrous when Carol had range and Fenrir had regeneration, so he decided to end the match with Charge Bullet before the frozen arena could drain his options. Mana began spiraling around his fist as Setsuna gathered power without stopping his movement. He dashed over the ice with the charged fist held close, silently committing to a single, decisive opening. The stands interpreted his defensive movement as proof that defeating a summoned beast was impossible. Setsuna's supporters called his name, worried that the charging technique was taking too long to matter. Lionel suddenly noticed something in the arena and widened his eyes. A student asked what was wrong, but Lionel only said nothing while keeping his attention locked on Setsuna's fist. Lionel explained that Charge Bullet normally required time to cast, making it nearly useless in a one-on-one fight. But Setsuna's mana control was so precise that he could charge the attack while moving through combat. Lionel admitted that feat was not easy, which was the closest thing to a compliment he could give while staying calm. Carol noticed the preparation and realized Setsuna was planning something, so she decided to interrupt before it finished. She called out Garuda, summoning a second familiar to attack from the opposite direction. The crowd reacted with shock because Carol had just doubled the problem without showing any sign of strain. Lionel recognized the simultaneous summoning and admitted that Carol's talent was every bit as dangerous as her reputation. Setsuna dropped into a low stance between Garuda and Fenrir as both familiars prepared to strike from opposite sides. The collision detonated through the frozen arena, sending debris and magical shockwaves across the ruins. A student screamed Setsuna's name, terrified that the simultaneous attack had finally overwhelmed him. Then a blue-charged fist cut through the impact, showing that Setsuna had kept the technique alive inside the chaos. The energy sharpened into blade-like forms, and the momentum of the battle shifted before either familiar could recover. Setsuna stood in the center with both hands glowing, facing Garuda and Fenrir without giving either beast an easy target. He acknowledged Carol as an outstanding mage and admitted that he expected her to have a trump card. Carol stared in disbelief after Setsuna deflected the attack she expected to end his charge. Setsuna raised his glowing hands and announced that it was his turn to attack. A shadow crossed his face as he snapped his fingers and declared that the match would end here. Purple energy concentrated at his hand, becoming a sharp point aimed not at Fenrir, but at something connected to Carol. A glowing sigil appeared across Carol's back, and the purple magic began forcing a reaction out of her body. Carol screamed and clutched her throat as the pressure overwhelmed her, making the victory suddenly feel like a rescue mission again. Setsuna rushed toward Carol and called her name, his attack fading as concern replaced the instinct to finish the fight. He stared at the magic surrounding her and realized that the energy was not an ordinary spell. A dark silhouette with enormous horns began emerging from the purple energy, bringing a heavy, unnatural presence into the arena. Setsuna recognized the mana immediately. It carried the same ominous signature as the evil god, and that was the last thing a final match needed. Carol's face twisted with pain as an overwhelming force pressed against her from the inside. A purple barrier erupted around her, and terrifying summons appeared inside it, including a multi-headed monster and a horned beast. The crowd stared at the growing army, while Lionel realized the mana flooding the arena was not coming from Carol. Lionel demanded that the match be stopped, and the barrier cancelled before the uncontrolled summons turned the arena into a graveyard. A mysterious observer explained that only the person who cast the barrier could cancel it. The observer smiled and suggested that the formation mages were already being hunted, which meant the emergency had spread beyond the arena. Lionel confronted the formation mage and noticed the glowing mark on his neck, confirming that someone else was controlling him too. Inside the barrier, Setsuna dodged through a storm of attacks from the summoned beasts and searched for the mana's owner. A winged creature swept across the arena while another beast attacked from below, forcing Setsuna to fight in every direction at once. He realized that finding the source was the only way to stop the summons and began following the flow of the strange mana. A hand pressed against the barrier as a voice mocked Setsuna for trying to look around while several monsters were already hunting him. The distraction cost him a second as the bird-like summon dove from above. The strike landed hard enough to throw Setsuna through the air and drag a cry of pain from him. He hit the ground injured while a red-haired student screamed his name from the stands. Setsuna pushed himself onto one knee with blood running from his arm, refusing to let the monsters decide the pace. Somewhere beyond the barrier, the antagonist smiled because every injury made the rescue less likely. The voice taunted Setsuna, claiming that locating the mana source while fighting multiple summons was impossible even for him. Lionel saw the real problem. Setsuna had no time to charge bullet before another attack arrived. Carol knelt inside the dark mana, already near her limit, and the longer the control continued, the greater the chance she would lose her life. Through the pain, Carol whispered for Setsuna to run, begging him to survive even if it meant abandoning her. Setsuna understood the truth. Carol was not attacking by choice, and an outside force was controlling her summons. A small glowing object fell from above and disappeared into the dark mana surrounding Carol, adding a new clue to the control. Carol cried and begged Setsuna to flee before the monsters killed him, but the plea only hardened his decision to stay. The beasts surrounded Setsuna, leaving him no clear escape route and no time to protect the exhausted summoner. He slipped beneath the multi-headed beast's strike and used its own momentum to keep moving. Setsuna launched into the air with blue mana coating his body, looking for a place where one counter could matter. His mana-infused blow tore through the air and forced the nearest creature to recoil. He kept attacking with focused precision, refusing to waste energy on strikes that could not open a path. At last, Setsuna faced the massive horned beast directly, and the real final confrontation began inside the chaos. He lowered his stance as the creature's limb descended, bracing his injured body for an impact that could end the fight. Setsuna caught the limb and redirected its force, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have crushed him. He vaulted above the beasts, with blue mana flashing around him, preparing to turn their crowded formation against them. A mana blade swept through the summoned creatures, cutting a path while the winged beast and the multi-headed monster closed in. An elderly man with long white hair watched from above, his stern eyes tracking every decision Setsuna made. Elsewhere, someone raced up a staircase and calculated that Setsuna's mana should already be more than half depleted. Lionel ran after the barrier mage, determined to find the caster before Setsuna's remaining strength disappeared. He whispered for Setsuna not to die, because the fight had become far too serious for a tournament lesson. Inside the arena, Setsuna stood bloodied and exhausted, while voices called his name through the barrier. Another beast struck him and damaged his leg, making every attempt to move cost more than the last. The red-haired student covered her mouth when she saw the injury, realizing how close Setsuna was to collapse. Students in the stands began asking whether Carol had gone too far, because this no longer looked like a controlled match. The controlling voice declared that Setsuna could not use magic anymore, turning his damaged body into a supposed dead end. The antagonist ordered the beasts to finish him, confident that numbers would finally overcome his fighting spirit. The summons charged together while Setsuna planted his feet and prepared to survive the next impact without an obvious weapon. A beast bit into his arm, and Setsuna screamed as blood covered the moment the enemy believed it had won. Lionel's earlier lesson echoed over the violence as he asked his students what mattered most to a close combat mage. One student answered that the goal was to close the gap, minimize damage, and subdue the enemy with one powerful blow. Lionel accepted the answer but said there was something even more important than technique. The true core was the fighting spirit to land one hit against impossible odds, even when every advantage belonged to the enemy. He called that principle endurance while receiving any attack, a training exercise that suddenly sounded exactly like Setsuna's current life. Pinned in the beast's jaws, Setsuna held onto one final thought while the summons prepared to tear him apart. Blood covered his mouth, but the determination in his eyes returned before the enemy could celebrate. Blue mana finally gathered in his hand, and Setsuna realized he had been charging it in secret the entire time. The hidden power exploded outward, blasting the beast away and sending a shockwave through the surrounding summons. The antagonist stared in disbelief, understanding that Setsuna had used the damaged arm as camouflage while silently building the counterattack. Setsuna kept the pressure on and declared that the summoned beasts were already out of control. He spotted a small opening in their formation and realized that one precise strike could finish every threat at once. The students watched in shock as Setsuna prepared the move that could decide whether he survived the final. He gathered every remaining drop of mana into one fist, accepting that the next attack had to be decisive. Setsuna lunged through the frozen ruins and shouted the technique's name, Charge Bullet. The concentrated beam pierced forward in a blinding burst and shoved back the creatures surrounding Carol. A pillar of blue mana tore through the arena, obliterating the summoned beasts and shattering the ground beneath them. Setsuna lunged through the ruined arena with Charge Bullet blazing in his fist, committing to the finishing move despite his wrecked body. The blue blast erupted across the ruins, swallowing Carol's position and turning the final exchange into a wall of light. The beam tore through the ground and hurled debris into the air, proving that Setsuna's new technique had no interest in subtle entrances. When the energy faded, Setsuna remained standing but barely, bloodied and panting with the last glow still clinging to his fist. Carol fell limp through the air, caught in the aftermath of the attack and unable to protect herself. Setsuna forced his injured body to move and rushed after her before the arena could claim a second victim. Carol's eyes stayed closed as she dropped helplessly, making the final rescue more urgent than the final score. Setsuna caught her and dropped to one knee, holding Carol while the last magical energy spun around them. Carol groaned faintly but did not wake, leaving Setsuna to judge her condition from the smallest sign of life. Blood ran down Setsuna's face as he looked at her and whispered that he was glad she was all right. The ruined ice field left them isolated in the center of the arena, surrounded by silence after the storm of summons. Students in the stands stared in disbelief and wondered whether the undefeated Carol had actually lost. The announcer struggled to speak, because declaring a winner after that kind of battle felt almost absurd. He finally named Setsuna Cromwell the winner, and reminded the crowd that close combat had waited a century for this victory. An elderly observer watched from above with an unreadable expression, as if the historic result was only one piece of a larger puzzle. Setsuna stood in the center of the arena with blood on his face and his fist clenched for the department he had just vindicated. The close combat students exploded into celebration, turning years of ridicule into one deafening victory cheer. Spectators kept asking what technique they had witnessed, because the final strike looked nothing like ordinary academy magic. A student watched with tears in her eyes while the person beside her grinned and shouted congratulations. Some supporters celebrated a winning bet, suddenly discovering that backing the underdog could be extremely profitable. Away from the celebration, a masked figure stood in a dark corridor over an unconscious victim and calmly noted Setsuna's growth. The figure pressed a finger to the victim's neck and left behind a small glowing mark, adding another silent piece to the conspiracy. A bearded man crawled through the corridor searching frantically, proving that the Academy's emergency had not ended with the applause. He stopped when he found an unconscious person on the floor and realized the situation had become worse than expected. Kneeling beside the victim, the bearded man stared at the damage and understood that someone had attacked the Academy from inside. Above the arena, the massive barrier began failing and dissolving after holding the dangerous mana inside for too long. Setsuna looked up as the barrier vanished and immediately knew that the situation beyond the final match had changed again. The headmaster descended into the arena and approached Setsuna, while the unconscious Carol remained on the ground. He explained that Carol had taken a serious blow after her summons were defeated together and confirmed that someone else had controlled her. The headmaster examined Carol and suspected a magic device, then ordered everyone to leave the rest of the investigation to the Academy. He addressed Setsuna by his full name, acknowledging that the winner was still standing after a battle that should have broken him. The headmaster praised Setsuna for revealing his true power and promised to keep the deal they had made. Setsuna smiled through the blood and thanked him, even though his body was already asking for a hospital bed. The headmaster walked away and instructed Setsuna to visit his chamber the next day. In the medical room, a healer covered Setsuna in green magic and began repairing the wounds Charge Bullet had left behind. The healer stabilized the external injuries, but warned that internal damage still required rest, which Setsuna treated as a suggestion rather than a rule. Bandaged from head to toe, Setsuna stretched carefully and tested how much of his body still belonged to him. A knock interrupted the recovery before he could get comfortable. His friends entered at once and asked whether his body was all right, receiving a suspiciously quick yes. Setsuna pointed at the bandages and reassured them that he was fine, relying heavily on the word fine. A companion celebrated his victory and admitted she was simply relieved that he had survived it. His male companions called him the pride of close combat magic, a title that would have sounded ridiculous to the Academy a week earlier. The group kept cheering and called him Setsuna Oni-chan until the medical room felt more like a victory party than a clinic. Setsuna smiled warmly, finally allowing himself to enjoy the win instead of immediately analyzing the next threat. Everyone gathered around his bed while the conversation shifted from celebration to the mystery behind the attack. They explained that the formation mage had survived, but had been rendered unconscious by whoever was moving through the Academy. Carol was resting and physically safe, but the Academy planned to question her as soon as she woke up. The group pointed out the obvious pattern. During the incident, Setsuna had been targeted more directly than anyone else. Setsuna's smile disappeared as he asked whether anyone understood what was actually happening. At that same moment, a hooded figure approached a guarded door in a dark corridor. Dark magic gathered around the handle as the intruder reached for the door, protecting Carol. The figure dismissed the barrier as useless and prepared to pass through it without leaving a trace. Inside the room, Carol slept while the hooded figure watched her from the darkness. The intruder declared that Carol would be eliminated first, followed by Setsuna. They entered the room and began erasing every trace of their presence, turning the assassination attempt into a ghost story in progress. Purple energy crackled around the intruder as they insisted that nothing happening here had any connection to them. A dark orb formed above Carol's sleeping body, gathering enough energy to finish what the tournament attack had started. Setsuna raced through the corridor in a blue blur, arriving before the orb could descend. He lunged into the room with his attention fixed on the intruder and Carol's exposed bed. Setsuna's eyes burned blue as he revealed that he had expected the attacker to target Carol in order to silence her. A sharp mana blade formed in his hand as he admitted that he never wanted their meeting to end in this confrontation. The hood fell back, revealing the intruder's face. Leo. Setsuna faced Leo, with blue eyes burning through the pain, his bandages proving that this confrontation had arrived far too soon after the final. Leo laughed from beneath the hood, treating the accusation like an entertaining surprise instead of a threat. He admitted that he had expected to leave no traces, then smiled because Setsuna had still exposed him. Setsuna explained that there was no physical evidence, but Leo's actions had finally made the truth undeniable. Leo stayed calm under the accusation, as if the danger of being discovered mattered less than the conversation itself. Setsuna stood over the unconscious patient while Leo waited in the background, and the silence made the stakes heavier than any speech. Leo suggested they move outside because the medical room smelled like medicine, casually stepping away from the person he had nearly killed. Under the full moon, the Academy courtyard became the stage for a confrontation neither friend could postpone anymore. Leo walked ahead, while Setsuna followed at a guarded distance, watching every movement instead of trusting the silence. Setsuna stumbled when his injuries flared, giving Leo a reminder that the final match had not left him at full strength. He admitted that the internal wounds had not healed, but stopping now would leave Carol alone with the person who targeted her. Leo noticed Setsuna's frightening expression and asked how long he had known that Leo was the culprit. Setsuna traced the suspicion back to the ceremony of blessings, when Leo disappeared and left an ominous gap in the story. He also remembered Leo losing the long-ranged representative position to Akhtar, a result that should have been impossible without underhanded interference. Leo was genuinely surprised that Setsuna had connected those pieces and looked almost amused by the detective work. Setsuna said the suspicion had become conviction the moment he saw Leo trying to erase Carol. He pointed out that Leo's attacks carried the same infused mana present during the final match and asked who supplied it. The question sharpened the air. Setsuna wanted to know exactly who Leo meant when he spoke about someone else. Dark aura gathered around Leo as the friendly conversation finally dropped its disguise. Leo asked whether Setsuna knew about that great person, his smile twisting into something closer to devotion than friendship. Setsuna's eyes widened, because the name was not a mystery. It was a threat he had already seen in another life. He recognized the shifting shape of the mana and concluded that Leo was a subordinate of the evil god. Leo said he could no longer let Setsuna do whatever he wanted, though he sounded disappointed that their game had to end. A red mark appeared on Leo as he said goodbye, turning the polite word into the opening signal of an execution. Setsuna lunged first with a blue mana blade, choosing to attack before Leo's supernatural advantage could fully unfold. Leo met the blade and nullified the strike on contact, making the collision flash without leaving a meaningful wound. The sensation reminded Setsuna of that terrible moment from the past, when ordinary magic had stopped mattering against a superior force. A heavy magical attack exploded through the courtyard, scattering debris while both fighters tried to claim the next opening. Leo explained that the great person had granted him authority over mana nullification, meaning no spell could reach him directly. The nullifying force shoved Setsuna backward, and the pain in his wounded body made the gap feel larger than the courtyard itself. Setsuna attacked again from the front, while Leo extended one hand to intercept the blade before it could connect. He refused to stop and shouted that the fight was not over, even though Leo had already dismantled his first answers. Setsuna discovered the limitation. Nullification activated only when Leo touched the attack, so a strike from a blind spot might bypass it. He moved with sudden speed and redirected his mana into a blade aimed from an unexpected angle. Leo still blocked the strike, and the impact burst outward hard enough to push both fighters apart. Leo mocked the attempt and claimed his mana detection was faster than Setsuna's ability to create a blind spot. Setsuna answered with a desperate fire attack, widening his options because the blue blade alone could not reach Leo. Leo admitted that he had wanted to fight Setsuna after a full recovery, making the current beating sound like an unfortunate scheduling issue. Setsuna dropped to his knees, gasping as the battle reopened injuries that had barely been treated. Leo praised his skill but called close combat magic a weakness, claiming Setsuna could have lasted longer with a long-range path. Then Leo's expression went cold, and he decided that the difference between their styles no longer mattered. He struck Setsuna again and promised that the injured fighter would die there. Setsuna clutched the wound and realized Leo was deliberately targeting the same damage left by the final match. The realization widened Setsuna's eyes, because Leo was not merely overpowering him, he was using the aftermath against him. Setsuna whispered Leo's name, as if saying it aloud could bring his old friend back. He demanded to know why Leo was doing this, but the answer came with the same cold curiosity as the attacks. Leo said he was tired of the world and enjoyed destroying the sandcastles other people spent their lives building. Setsuna could barely process that such destruction rested on nothing more than a bored man's reason. A memory of people screaming for help returned to him, connecting Leo's casual cruelty to the devastation Setsuna had once witnessed. The flashback widened into a city burning, showing the cost of the world Leo treated like a toy. Setsuna shouted at Leo to stop messing around, refusing to let the old name become an excuse for surrender. He asked whether the person in front of him was really Leo, because the friend he knew would never speak about destruction this way. Leo answered with a crackling hand and ordered Setsuna to shut his mouth. Dark energy intensified around Leo as he raised his hand for the final attack. Setsuna realized he still could not use a stable mana blade and needed to bring the fight to point-blank range immediately. He recalled the sensation of the earlier attack and used that memory as the only guide left to him. Mana gathered into Setsuna's fist as he prepared one final desperate strike instead of waiting for Leo's hand to fall. Setsuna told himself that he still had a chance, because close combat only needed one opening to change the result. His energy blade flared brightly, and he committed to the attack with everything his battered body could still produce. Leo dodged with insulting ease and called Setsuna too slow. Setsuna stared in terror as he realized Leo's casting was faster than his own reaction, a gap that felt almost divine. Before Leo could finish the next attack, a massive beam of white energy tore through the space between them. White flames burned across the courtyard, and Setsuna questioned what kind of magic could interrupt Leo's nullification. Leo stood amid the ruins and directed the pillar of white fire, his dark energy and the new flames colliding in the night. Setsuna looked toward the roof and saw a winged, demonic silhouette perched beneath the full moon, adding another impossible threat to the scene. Three faces framed the aftermath, the stern principal, the blue-eyed fighter, and the red-marked figure whose presence had poisoned the night. A massive white dragon descended through fire and placed itself between Leofair and the attack, giving the frightened student one more breath. The principal apologized for arriving late, but Leofair insisted that he had already arrived in time to save him. With one glowing eye fixed on the red-marked antagonist, the principal accused him of causing the exchange match incident. Donnan smiled because the principal had noticed the trail, confirming that the chaos at the tournament was not an accident. The principal explained that he had followed the residual mana from the arena directly to Donnan. Donnan mocked him as the academy's top student and admitted that suspecting one of his own students had been difficult. The principal answered with a massive burst of magic that lit the battlefield and ended the conversation's polite phase. Leofer stared into the crackling discharge, caught between awe at the power and fear of what it might destroy. The principal declared that he needed to constrain the enemy before the battle consumed the academy around them. The white dragon roared, gathering enough magical force to make the air vibrate around its body. The principal planted his feet and extended one hand, shaping the next defense with calm precision. The dragon answered with a torrent of fire that engulfed the battlefield and erased the ground beneath the flames. Leofer watched the fire spread and admitted that its power was far beyond anything he had expected from a phantom beast. Donnan raised one hand through the heat, dark energy gathering as he prepared to answer the dragon's attack. He stood inside a vortex of fire with a cold expression, proving that the flames had not shaken his confidence. Donnan recognized the white dragon as the strongest rumored phantom beast and admitted that only the authority granted by his great master kept him safe. The principal realized that magic nullification was not a rumor, but a real power standing directly in front of him. Leofer asked whether the principal had known about the existence of such a dangerous ability. The answer reached back to an old prophecy. When unknown dark powers awakened, the world would be engulfed in disaster, and nullification was one of them. Donnan shifted his stance and prepared his next move, treating the warning like a challenge rather than a prophecy. He taunted the principal by claiming that ordinary magic would not work against him, and that the same weakness applied to the principal's allies. Donnan raised a multicolored aura and announced his name, as if the battlefield itself needed to remember who was attacking it. Leofer recognized the spell as three-element compound magic and understood that Donnan was combining systems instead of relying on one. The principal closed his eyes and gathered his own energy, preparing a countermeasure rather than meeting the compound attack head-on. A golden symbol appeared in the principal's eye, revealing that his preparation involved a technique far older than ordinary casting. Donnan formed a massive ball of energy in his hand and held it there like a promise that the next strike would be worse. The compound magic expanded into a dark space of floating orbs and colored streams, turning the battlefield into a volatile storm. The principal calmly told Setsuna to take 2 steps right, while Setsuna stared at the strange golden light in his eyes. Donnan launched a concentrated purple blast that crossed the void toward the principal and Setsuna with overwhelming speed. The blast struck where they had stood, but Setsuna followed the instruction and escaped the direct impact by a heartbeat. The principal remained unharmed and moved through the destruction with the calm of someone who had seen the attack before it arrived. Donnan stared in disbelief because the shot should have hit them without question. The principal asked why he was surprised and whether Donnan truly believed only his magic could work in this battle. He acknowledged Donnan's interesting power while hinting that the Golden Eye was already preparing an answer. Donnan answered with a darker aura and asked the principal to handle what came next. A massive wave of dark energy erupted from Donnan and cracked the space around him with its force. Setsuna watched in terror and recognized the truth inside that energy. It was the power of an evil god. Donnan promised to leave no trace of the principal behind and raised his hand for what looked like the final blow. The principal admitted that this would not be an easy battle, finally treating Donnan as a genuine catastrophe rather than a student gone wrong. The battlefield stretched around them, and the principal warned that a serious fight between both sides could destroy the academy completely. He called Setsuna's name and prepared to change the strategy before the next exchange erased the surrounding grounds. Setsuna answered that he understood, ready to follow the principal's instructions instead of charging blindly into evil god power. The principal began a chant and called on pure phantasm butterflies to grant him their wings. Golden energy spread through the winged creature behind him, and its wings expanded with a new level of power. The empowered phantom beast rose behind the principal like a second guardian over the academy. It swept its wings forward and released a massive gust of energy that forced Donnan to react. Donnan realized that the principal was using the beast to minimize damage to the academy instead of maximizing the attack. He dismissed that restraint as the principal's duty and continued gathering dark energy for the counterattack. The phantom beast's power collided with Donnan's darkness in an explosion that shook the entire battlefield. The two forces pushed against each other, filling the night with blinding light and unstable magical pressure. The collision began to fade into sparks, leaving both sides measuring the next move through the smoke. The winged beast spread its wings again and prepared another attack before Danon could regain the initiative. Danon steadied the dark aura around himself and braced for the incoming strike, without losing his confidence. The phantom beast unleashed a second blast, forcing Danon backward through a vortex of light. Danon reached toward the principal and mocked him, asking whether he would surrender and grant victory to his student. The principal answered that the old man would retire, sounding tired but not defeated. Above him, Leo hovered inside a vortex of blue energy and prepared a decisive attack of his own. Danon noticed that the dragon had hidden Leo's approach and called the surprise attack clever, though he still looked confident. A glowing hexagonal barrier formed around Danon, and he taunted Leo as if the defense could not be broken. An unseen warning told Leo that he was relying too much on his current power, forcing him to reconsider the attack before committing. Leo descended through a concentrated beam of blue energy and decided that choosing close combat had been the right choice. Danon grinned behind the barrier and warned everyone not to underestimate the power standing against him. Leo lunged directly into the red hexagonal barrier, turning the next moment into a collision between close combat and mana nullification. Danon's grin remained sharp, but blood appeared at his chin as the impact finally reached him through the defense. His bared teeth and bloodied mouth showed that the barrier was holding, but the cost of holding it was beginning to show. Setsuna forced more mana through his body and shouted for greater speed, pushing the technique beyond what his wounds wanted to allow. He lunged across the battlefield in a blue blur, finally moving fast enough to turn close combat into a surprise instead of a limitation. The punch connected directly and shattered the ground beneath the fighters, proving that one clean hit could still change the entire battle. Dust and debris erupted around the impact, hiding the result while the residual mana tore through the battlefield. Setsuna stood inside the fading dust with mana still crackling from his hand, refusing to assume the fight was over. The principal analyzed the exchange and realized that even magic nullification had a limit on how quickly it could activate. He praised Setsuna while the defeated opponent lay in the dust, making the direct strike look like a successful experiment. Setsuna confirmed his theory. The speed of a direct attack could bypass the nullification technique's reaction time. He walked toward the principal, proud that choosing this close combat path had finally produced a practical answer. The principal called the technique splendid and insisted that Setsuna's wounds needed treatment, while Setsuna admitted he had learned a great deal. Then Leo forced himself back onto his feet and told Setsuna that he was always beyond expectation. Setsuna stared in disbelief because Leo had survived a direct attack that should have ended the fight. Blood ran from Leo's mouth as he smiled and began gathering another dangerous power. Purple energy surged around Leo's hand as he announced that it was his turn to attack. A concentrated blast of darkness flew toward Setsuna, forcing him to raise a defense before the energy reached his chest. Setsuna formed a blue mana blade and prepared to intercept the projectile head-on. He leaped into the clash and swung the blade through the dark blast, meeting power with precise close-range timing. The blade fractured the energy at first, scattering pieces of the attack before they began moving in a more complicated pattern. Setsuna realized the blast was not simple mana, and struggled to keep his defense from being swallowed by its changing shape. The explosion finally threw him backward, and left his body silhouetted inside a second burst of light. The principal called Setsuna's name as the battle suddenly became more dangerous than the first exchange. Setsuna lay on the ground trying to understand what Leo had just used against him. He suspected Leo had mixed long-range magic with mana nullification, but his consciousness was already fading before he could test the theory. The scene shifted to a training ground where a distant target was struck with impossible precision. More targets lined up, and every projectile landed perfectly in the center, as if range itself had stopped being a challenge. The unseen shooter called the distance as easy as breakfast, a casual boast that made the earlier battle feel even more unfair. Setsuna reflected on Leo's long-range mastery and admitted that he could not sit idle after seeing it. A dark figure reached forward with a clawed hand and declared that Setsuna's head would be the next target. Setsuna looked shaken and asked Leo what he meant, still hoping the threat came from someone else. Leo told him to look behind him and called him a failure as a hero, turning the attack into psychological warfare. A nightmare filled the darkness with people Setsuna had failed to save, accusing him of abandoning them despite their faith in him. Their voices repeated Setsuna's name until the nightmare became a tunnel, with no room left for anything except guilt. Setsuna woke in a hospital bed, gasping for air, sweat on his skin and the nightmare still clinging to his eyes. Layla rushed to his side as he sat up, finding him wrapped in even more bandages after the second defeat. She was simply relieved that Setsuna had finally opened his eyes. Setsuna asked where he was, and Layla told him he had been recovering in the academy infirmary. Then she revealed that he had been unconscious for 3 full days. Setsuna repeated the number in disbelief, realizing how much had happened while his body refused to wake up. He clenched his fist as frustration replaced the relief of surviving. Setsuna sat on the edge of the bed with his head lowered, carrying the weight of another loss while Layla watched him carefully. He suddenly asked about the principal, because answers mattered more to him than the condition of his own wounds. Layla said the principal was probably in his chamber, while Lionel was occupied in a meeting. Setsuna tried to stand immediately, and Layla asked where he thought he was going. He insisted that he needed to meet the principal and confirm something, while Layla reminded him that his body was still covered in wounds. Setsuna gently touched Layla's braid, softening the argument before asking her to trust him one more time. He apologized for worrying her, but still asked her to let him go. Despite the pain, Setsuna stood and prepared to leave the infirmary. A golden chandelier marked the shift into the academy's formal meeting rooms. The principal sat at the head of an ornate table while several people gathered for a meeting about the crisis. He told the attendees he was counting on them, then admitted that the academy was about to become very busy. The attendees left with uneasy expressions, because being counted on by the principal sounded more frightening than reassuring. Setsuna burst into the room and interrupted the meeting before anyone could object to his medical condition. He called out to the principal with urgent eyes. The principal welcomed him and admitted he was glad Setsuna had survived. The room settled into silence as the principal prepared to explain what happened after Setsuna lost consciousness. A bearded man in formal clothing looked back with an annoyed click, clearly unhappy that the meeting had been interrupted. Elsewhere, a professor placed a hand on a younger man's shoulder and reminded him that he had lost badly. He postponed the full conversation and mentioned that Layla and Drago had been worried about the younger man. The younger man watched him leave through the grand doorway and called after him as professor. Back in the chamber, Setsuna faced the principal in the formal room and prepared to hear the part of the story he had missed. He bowed his head and apologized for disappointing the principal, still carrying the defeat like a personal failure. Then he looked up and urgently asked what happened after he passed out. The principal told him to calm down because he was still wounded, and the answer would not change by force of impatience. He began the account with the moment Setsuna lost consciousness. In the flashback, a marked man stood over the unconscious fighter, while the principal watched from the blue-lit darkness. The antagonist looked satisfied, enjoying the chance to finish the person he had already defeated. He admitted that he wanted to finish Setsuna but had spent too much mana for the day. Looking up at the moon with a dark blade in hand, he decided that the fight had still been fun enough to satisfy him. The antagonist prepared to leave and told the principal they would meet again in the future. The principal watched him go with a stern expression, already considering how dangerous the escape had been. The story returned to the present as Setsuna sat on the sofa and quietly processed the account. He thought about the eyes he had seen beyond the portal and suggested that they belonged to an existence no one understood. The principal studied him in silence, then asked whether Setsuna knew something about the entity. Setsuna reacted with shock, because the question had reached much closer to the truth than he was ready to reveal. Setsuna sat across from the headmaster in a candlelit chamber, carrying a future full of disasters that no normal student should know. The headmaster looked directly at him and asked the question Setsuna had been avoiding. Did he know something? Setsuna froze, because the truth was easy to remember and almost impossible to explain. The headmaster adjusted his beard and waited, giving Setsuna enough silence to feel the weight of every possible answer. Then he revealed a glowing mark on his palm and confirmed that he knew the magic connected to the exchange incident. He asked Setsuna to explain how he possessed that knowledge, admitting that he wanted to believe him. Setsuna looked down and wondered whether speaking about the future would sound less like a warning and more like madness. A vision of a tentacled entity above a burning landscape returned, reminding him exactly why keeping quiet was not an option anymore. Still, Setsuna doubted the headmaster would believe a story about time travel and a destroyed world. The headmaster asked whether there was a specific reason Setsuna could not speak, trying to make honesty feel possible. Setsuna finally looked up and decided that changing their fate required more than careful silence. A key idea struck him, and his eyes sharpened as he realized he had a way to prove the impossible story. He told the headmaster to examine the Necklace of Revival, an artifact that could carry evidence from a different timeline. The headmaster held the necklace and immediately sensed that something about it was wrong. The blessing of the Spirit of Time had vanished completely, proving that the necklace had already spent its power once before. Setsuna confirmed the conclusion. The necklace had been used in another timeline. He admitted that 10 years in the future, he used its power because regret had become stronger than his fear of the unknown. The two men sat across from each other as the private conversation shifted from suspicion to shared responsibility. The headmaster said he understood the situation, no longer treating Setsuna's story as a student chasing an impossible excuse. He repeated the future aloud. The headmaster would be assassinated, and the evil god would destroy the world. The headmaster acknowledged that returning 10 years required an immense regret, validating the pain Setsuna had carried alone. The room's high angle made the two men look isolated, but the conversation had finally placed them on the same side. The headmaster placed a reassuring hand on Setsuna's shoulder and recognized the tragic fate he had endured without help. Setsuna looked up as the support reached him, softening the defenses he had built around the future. The headmaster promised that from now on, he would also become Setsuna's strength. Setsuna thanked him with visible relief, because the world's fate no longer rested on one exhausted student alone. Together, they might finally save the world from the destruction Setsuna had already witnessed. The headmaster offered to teach Setsuna a second kind of magic, designed specifically to counter the evil god. He reached out and began the explanation, shifting the meeting from confession to training. The new system was called spirit magic, a unique power that did not belong to any existing school of magic. Setsuna reacted with surprise because a power outside the normal system could be exactly what the evil god would not expect. The headmaster suggested changing locations so the lesson could become a demonstration instead of another conversation. They reached a green forest clearing that Setsuna remembered from earlier training, and the familiar ground carried its own nostalgia. The headmaster explained that spirit magic merged the user with a spirit, using mana as a catalyst to house extraordinary power in the body. Unlike ordinary systems, spirit magic allowed unusual combinations of abilities, which was its greatest advantage. Setsuna stared at the possibility and realized that this power could change everything about his close combat limits. The headmaster decided a demonstration would be faster than a longer explanation and began gathering a golden aura. His eyes glowed with a mystical gold, revealing the spirit-related power before Setsuna could ask another question. Setsuna recognized those eyes from the battle with Leo and understood that the headmaster's magic belonged to the same frightening category. Then the headmaster suggested playing rock, paper, scissors, which was not the training method Setsuna had expected from a legendary mentor. Setsuna stared at him in confusion, waiting for the hidden lesson inside the ridiculous request. The headmaster explained that they could not spar while Setsuna was wounded, so a hand game would substitute for an actual exchange. The first round ended with the headmaster showing scissors while Setsuna showed rock. The headmaster called it his victory and immediately suggested another round, apparently enjoying the safest duel in academy history. He played scissors again, turning the harmless game into a demonstration of a very unfair advantage. Round after round, the headmaster kept revealing scissors before Setsuna could catch the pattern. Setsuna finally admitted that he could not win, which was not a sentence he enjoyed saying even during rock, paper, scissors. The headmaster revealed the trick. The spirit of time granted a precognitive eye that could see a few seconds into the future. He added that a contract with the spirit of wind could grant flight, proving that each spirit carried a different kind of impossible advantage. The spirit of water could let its user pass through physical attacks, making ordinary defense look suddenly outdated. Setsuna understood that mastering spirit magic could make his close combat path far more flexible. The headmaster warned that a contract was required, but first Setsuna had to complete a preliminary step. The timing was perfect, so the headmaster decided to begin the preliminary training immediately. He closed his eyes and focused, showing Setsuna the posture needed to approach the spirits without forcing them. A soft golden glow surrounded the headmaster as he entered a meditative state. Setsuna watched closely, recognizing that the quiet part of the lesson might be harder than any battlefield. The headmaster instructed him to empty his mind, become one with nature, and feel the spirits already present around them. Setsuna stood still and tried to copy the posture, though his entire body looked like it was preparing to punch the air. He closed his eyes and asked the spirits to lend him power against the evil god, while a single leaf drifted through the silence. The headmaster observed without interrupting, waiting to see whether Setsuna could sense anything beyond his own urgency. Nothing happened, and Setsuna stood in the field frustrated while the headmaster noticed the problem immediately. Setsuna admitted that he could feel nothing, and the headmaster suggested that resentment in his nature was blocking the connection. The headmaster explained that becoming one with nature required inner peace, which meant standing apart from the thoughts driving Setsuna forward. Setsuna tried again, holding still while every instinct demanded that he find power faster. His mind filled with the need to become stronger quickly and the fear of losing another comrade, but he forced the distractions down. The headmaster placed a hand on his shoulder and told him not to rush. He admitted that it had taken him 3 years to become one with nature, but Setsuna should master it before the evil god descended in 5. Setsuna called 5 years too late and mentioned the apostles, accidentally revealing another threat the headmaster had not expected him to know. The headmaster explained that the apostles came from the same other world as the evil god and possessed powers different from magic. Setsuna realized that Leo, with his magic disintegration, was undoubtedly one of those apostles. He recalled fighting one apostle before returning and admitted that even with a long-range advantage, the enemy had been terrifyingly strong. The 12 dark powers in the Silver Rock family legend suddenly felt less like a story, because others like Leo could already be hiding in the world. The headmaster understood the fear but warned that emotional disorder could invite another crisis, so Setsuna needed patience as much as strength. He suggested that Setsuna might grasp spirit magic during joint training in a dungeon, and the word training caught Setsuna's attention immediately. The headmaster said Lionel would explain the details later. He promised that the dungeon would offer Setsuna a chance to surpass his current limits. But the journey would be harsh, so the headmaster ordered Setsuna to rest his body properly before chasing the next power. At the same time, a dark creature waited in a dungeon, turning the promised training into a surprise Setsuna was not ready to meet. The demonic creature's red eyes opened as the new arc began, and Setsuna's next lesson in spirit magic acquired a very hungry audience. Leofair finally entered the imposing hall with a casual smile and admitted that he was late, as if punctuality was the only crime on the agenda. A red-eyed, wolf-like figure confronted him for making everyone wait and asked whether the novice wanted to die. The hall identified the threat clearly. Zagan, the 10th Dark Apostle, was not someone who enjoyed repeating himself. A clown-faced figure mocked Leofair for failing to kill a single student after acting alone during the incident. The clown was named Puker, the 9th Dark Apostle, and his playful expression made the interrogation more disturbing instead of less. Leofair apologized to Zagan with a lazy smile, treating the failure like an awkward mistake between seniors and juniors. He explained that he lost his cool in front of his best friend, then revealed himself as the 12th Dark Apostle. Zagan demanded that Leofair wipe the smirk off his face, because arrogance was becoming more irritating than the failure. Zagan raised a clawed hand filled with dark energy and prepared to punish him personally. An unseen command stopped the attack before it landed. A third figure ordered both apostles to act like apostles and remember the vision of their great being. Satanakia questioned why the others still failed to understand the necessity of their mission. The second Dark Apostle released a burst of darkness that silenced the room through raw authority. Even Leofair stared and muttered in awe, finally remembering that the meeting was not a comedy show. Satanakia told them it was time to proceed and shifted the room from punishment to planning. He demanded personal reports first, keeping the apostles focused on the mission instead of their rivalries. Zagan blamed Leofair for the mess and promised to deal with the brat personally if he interfered again. Puker volunteered to handle the assassination himself because he found the idea more interesting that way. Satanachia rejected the offer and said another arrangement had already been made. He trusted the chosen person to succeed, leaving the apostles with a new assassin and the academy with no warning. A few days after the exchange match, Setsuna returned to a classroom and tried to behave like a normal student again. A red-haired classmate asked whether his body was all right, and Setsuna claimed theory class was safe enough for him. She pointed out that he was still getting injured after the final, and correctly guessed that something else had happened. Setsuna lowered his gaze and kept the confrontation with Leo to himself, because the academy was not ready for the whole truth. In a quiet grassy area, the headmaster explained that the existence of the evil god and its apostles still had to remain secret from the public. The trusted professors would handle the search for Leo and the academy's security, while Setsuna focused on surviving the next threat. For now, spirit magic training was postponed, forcing Setsuna to recover before chasing the power he wanted. Setsuna smiled and apologized for causing worry, insisting that he was doing all right even with both hands still wrapped. At the table, he admitted that recovery had to come quickly because getting stronger was no longer optional. The red-haired student watched him grip the table, seeing the determination behind the bandages. A muscular instructor called the class to order, ending the quiet recovery conversation. He announced that the faculties would soon begin a joint training exercise. Setsuna reacted immediately because the announcement matched the dungeon training the headmaster had promised. The instructor explained that students from multiple faculties would work together instead of competing against one another. Unlike the exchange matches, which taught separate battle styles, this exercise would focus on teamwork and breaking each faculty's limits. Setsuna and his classmate listened as the instructor said the real goal was improving cooperation between mages. The training would take place inside a one-star underground dungeon, which sounded manageable until the instructor emphasized the danger. Participation was based on candidacy, and the training would begin in 2 weeks, giving everyone a short deadline to prepare. Setsuna recognized it as the headmaster's promised training and decided his first priority was healing the wounds still limiting him. The red-haired student invited Setsuna to dinner, apparently deciding that recovery worked better with food and company. Setsuna agreed because eating well and recovering before the dungeon was common sense, even if common sense was not usually his specialty. As they walked, students recognized Setsuna as the exchange match winner and praised the close combat mage who had overturned every prediction. 2 girls whispered that one of them was a fan, proving the academy's opinion had changed faster than Setsuna's bandages could come off. His companion pointed out the irony. Students who had mocked Setsuna days ago were now gossiping about him with admiration. They continued across the academy grounds while the attention around Setsuna kept growing. A group approached and asked whether Setsuna was the close combat mage who had won the match. Setsuna confirmed it calmly, already wondering why victory kept attracting conversations he never requested. The students identified their leader as Carl from the noble's salon and mentioned rumors that he would join the army after graduation. Carl invited Setsuna to join his salon, leaving Setsuna stuck on the word salon instead of the offer. Carl explained that the salon was an exclusive community for high-level noble bloodline mages, making an exception because Setsuna was the winner. He claimed that adding the exchange champion would put nothing beyond the salon's reach. The surrounding students reacted as though Carl personally scouting Setsuna was an honor too valuable to refuse. Carl insisted that a connection like this was necessary for someone who had just won the exchange match. Then he insulted Setsuna's companion and warned that associating with a useless commoner could ruin Setsuna's future. Setsuna answered with one calm refusal, rejecting the salon before Carl could finish selling its importance. He added that bloodline was irrelevant to magic and accused Carl of wasting his time. Carl's face twisted with rage while nearby students quietly enjoyed watching the noble lose control. Carl shouted about insulting nobles and manifested a golden chain weapon in a spectacularly poor response to rejection. The chain transformed into a glowing blade as Carl abandoned conversation and chose violence instead. He lunged toward Setsuna with the blade raised, apparently unaware that the winner of the exchange match was not an easy target. Carl swung and called Setsuna an imbecile while the surrounding students reacted in alarm. Setsuna stayed calm and prepared to stop the blade with his bare hand. Layla intercepted the weapon and reminded Carl that personal fights were forbidden inside the academy. She challenged Carl's discipline and asked who was actually failing to keep order. Carl called her a commoner and demanded that she remember her place, proving that the salon's bloodline obsession was the real weakness. Layla forced Carl to release the weapon, sending him stumbling backward while his followers rushed to him. Carl and his group retreated in humiliation as Layla called them idiots and Carl shouted for everyone to leave. Even while retreating, Carl threatened to report the incident to his father because apparently losing an argument required a family escalation. Layla paused after they left, looking thoughtful as the campus returned to normal around them. She smiled at Setsuna and admitted that he was getting stronger, though she was probably thinking more about his attitude than his punches. A new pair of boots stepped onto the stone path, announcing another interruption before dinner could begin. A newcomer called out to Setsuna with visible surprise, as if finding the tournament winner outside class was unexpected. Carol appeared with a friendly wave, and the mood shifted from noble drama to a much softer reunion. Carol said she was glad Setsuna was fine, while Layla reminded her that Setsuna was the reason she was safe at all. Carol clasped her hands and admitted that she wanted to show Setsuna her gratitude. Then Carol invited Setsuna to her room, leaving Layla stunned and Setsuna facing a completely different kind of danger before the dungeon arc began. Carol leaned close and invited Setsuna to her room, instantly making the hallway 10 times more dramatic than it needed to be. The orange-haired girl reacted with pure shock, apparently imagining a much more scandalous reason for the invitation. The mystery ended at Carol's ornate private room door, where the actual danger turned out to be hospitality. Carol opened her arms and offered homemade food as repayment for Setsuna saving her during the final. Setsuna arrived with the others, including Drago, while Carol promised to start cooking immediately. The orange-haired girl volunteered to help because handling the entire kitchen alone would exhaust Carol. She realized the invitation was only about cooking and wondered why she had been invited too, while the room quietly laughed at her assumptions. Carol said she invited everyone because more people made the meal better, leaving Setsuna and Drago slightly confused by the cheerful logic. In the kitchen, the orange-haired helper discovered ingredients with healing effects and learned that Carol called them healing foods. Setsuna waited in the hallway and listened to the cheerful kitchen sounds, enjoying a peace that still felt unfamiliar. Then his thoughts returned to Carol's missing memory of the Leo incident, and he wondered whether shock or manipulation had erased it. Setsuna was glad nothing worse had happened to Carol, but the possibility of other targets kept the celebration from feeling completely safe. Drago approached and asked whether Setsuna was lost in thought again. He pointed out that Setsuna kept trying to handle everything alone and suggested taking a real break for once. Setsuna considered the idea, crossed his arms, and accidentally put enough strength into the motion to crack the furniture. Both men stared at the damaged sofa, silently agreeing that Setsuna's definition of rest needed more work. Drago compared the situation to physical training and asked whether it was dangerous, while Setsuna dismissed the concern as nonsense. Carol peeked in and asked Drago for help, and he agreed before discovering what kind of help she meant. Minutes later, Drago wore a maid apron because Carol's room apparently had only one category of work clothes. The group rallied around the meal, turning Setsuna's recovery break into a coordinated kitchen operation. Carol, Layla, and Drago invited Setsuna to enjoy the food they had prepared for him. The table filled with roasted chicken, fish, drinks, and enough dishes to feed a squad instead of 4 students. Setsuna stared at the spread, surprised that a recovery meal could look like a festival. Carol apologized for making too much, but Setsuna assured her that an excessive amount of healing food was not a problem. He thanked them, and decided that since they had made everything for him, finishing it was the least he could do. Then Setsuna activated Physical Boost to enhance his digestion, proving that even dinner could become a training exercise. He began eating at impossible speed, turning the table into a battlefield where the enemy was simply a mountain of food. The dishes kept disappearing while everyone else watched Setsuna treat healing calories like ammunition. The orange-haired girl asked whether he was all right, and Setsuna answered yes without slowing down. He paused long enough to praise the egg soup, calling its rich flavor genuinely delicious. Drago revealed that he had made the soup and offered more, which Setsuna accepted immediately. Carol stared at the empty dishes and announced that she had lost the cooking contest without realizing one had started. Setsuna smiled to himself, quietly enjoying a peaceful moment that did not involve an apostle, a dragon, or an exploding arena. In the grand dining hall, he admitted that a life like this was not bad at all, but the thought opened a memory of his previous life, when peaceful meals with comrades had once seemed normal. Setsuna returned to the present and vowed that the evil god would not destroy this peaceful life a second time. 2 weeks later, Setsuna and the other students gathered at the dungeon entrance for joint training. The waiting students filled the entrance with chatter and anticipation, each group pretending not to be nervous. Setsuna's team assembled near the entrance and prepared to move into the underground danger zone. Drago checked whether Setsuna was in top condition, still treating his recovery like a team responsibility. Setsuna credited the healing foods Drago had prepared over the past days for getting him ready in time. Drago dismissed the thanks and warned that close combat fighters needed healing food continuously or its effect would fade. Setsuna realized that he and Drago were on the same team, making this dungeon different from every battle he had fought alone. He trusted Drago enough to leave his back in the other fighters' hands. Upperclassmen arrived and apologized for keeping everyone waiting, officially starting the team introductions. A third-year formation student introduced himself as Mifune. Mifune introduced Yuzuha, who greeted Setsuna and Drago with a friendly wave. Drago introduced himself from close combat, and Setsuna followed with his own name. Mifune recognized Setsuna as the exchange match winner and said they should work together. Setsuna and Drago agreed that Mifune seemed cheerful, which was either a good sign or the beginning of a very elaborate surprise. Yuzuha whispered that Setsuna looked gentle enough to lower people's guard, making Setsuna wonder whether he had accidentally become suspicious. Mifune smiled knowingly and replied that appearances were accurate for now, leaving his cheerful confidence slightly less trustworthy. A professor stepped forward and confirmed that everyone had arrived, so the joint training could finally begin. Professor Giovanni Bertolini explained that formation and close combat would cooperate throughout the exercise. Their destination was the ruin of the Sealed Demon, a one-star dungeon containing ancient monsters and undead. Giovanni warned that the students would defeat those monsters through real combat, not a classroom simulation. He raised a bracelet of memory that would record every feat inside the dungeon. Monster loot counted as bonus points, meaning every defeated enemy could help the team climb the score. Treasure chests offered even larger rewards, turning exploration into a race for both survival and valuables. Anyone who earned more than 100 personal points would receive the chance to train with the kingdom's Magus Battalion. Setsuna focused immediately on the Magus Battalion instead of the medals, because that name carried memories from another life. He admitted that he missed the battalion and the comrades who had once stood beside him. In his memory, those comrades were the strength of the kingdom, and Setsuna had met many of them before his regression. Giovanni warned everyone not to enter the deeper floors, where stronger monsters waited beyond the training's intended limits. He repeated that some monsters could not be handled alone, making the deeper floors a forbidden shortcut to disaster. The bracelet of memory also contained an emergency function, inject mana, and it would teleport the student back to safety. Setsuna set his personal goal at 100 points, aiming directly at the Magus Battalion opportunity. Then he reconsidered and realized that 100 points was not ambitious enough for him. Setsuna and Drago exchanged a look and agreed that their real target was 200 points. The two looked ready while Yuzuha giggled behind them, apparently entertained by the new standard they had invented. Drago said he was looking forward to seeing what Setsuna planned to do with that goal. Setsuna agreed, because 200 points sounded exactly like the kind of unreasonable target he preferred. Giovanni asked whether everyone was ready to begin. Yuzuha stood prepared, her expression replacing curiosity with determination. The other students settled into their starting positions, ready to prove whether teamwork was more than a speech. Setsuna and Drago activated their mana and prepared to enter the dungeon together. One student watched them with a doubtful expression, already wondering whether 200 points was confidence or insanity. Yuzuha observed quietly, measuring the team before the first monster forced everyone to reveal their real abilities. Giovanni's eyes stayed fixed on the students, suggesting he expected the dungeon to expose more than their teamwork. The students rushed inside as Giovanni declared the joint training officially begun. Setsuna and Drago sprinted through the ancient corridor with blue mana burning around them, because apparently joint training began at full speed. The one-star ruin of the Sealed Demon stretched around them, an ancient dungeon that looked far too large for its rating. Skeletal undead appeared along the route, confirming that the monsters inside were hostile to every living intruder. Setsuna admitted that even teleportation magic did not make this practice safe, because a bad landing could still place them inside a monster. Drago called out that the path ahead was open, giving the pair another reason to keep moving instead of admiring the architecture. A golden magical shackle around a boot flashed as they ran, hinting that the dungeon had more enchantments than simple stone walls. They entered a massive underground hall and stared at the impossible amount of space hidden beneath the ruins. Ancient vegetation grew through the stone, making Setsuna wonder whether an entire civilization had once lived inside this dungeon. He remembered the headmaster's warning and recognized that this training could become essential for missions against the apostles. Setsuna wrote down his 2 goals: master spirit magic and collect every training point the dungeon offered. More students caught up and complained that Setsuna and Drago had been moving too fast for the rest of the team. Someone told them to look ahead, and the group slowed as the corridor opened into a choice. At the junction, the students agreed that this was where the teams had to split and decide their own route. Setsuna studied the 2 paths and called the obvious route a trap. Other students agreed that in a point-based competition, choosing the deeper route was the logical way to find better rewards. The group chose the deeper path and stepped away from the safer route everyone else expected them to take. Setsuna asked whether one companion was worried, admitting that the point system made the reckless choice sound reasonable. They passed a wall covered in vegetation, and Setsuna slowed because something about it did not belong in the corridor. He pointed at the wall and declared that it was fake. The others reacted in shock and asked whether he was certain. Setsuna explained that the vegetation looked wrong and suspected a huge room was hidden behind it. One student suggested the vegetation might be a coincidence, which was a brave opinion to share beside Setsuna's instincts. Setsuna heard wind coming from the other side, rejected the coincidence, and struck the wall. The false wall crumbled and revealed a hidden passage, instantly upgrading Setsuna's suspicion into a proven dungeon shortcut. Setsuna smiled and asked whether this was the right path, already knowing the answer from the wind. The group praised his insight and Drago's strength, because breaking through secret walls was becoming a team specialty. Everyone expected the hidden route to produce a mountain of points. The team dashed down a spiral staircase, chasing the rewards deeper beneath the dungeon. A massive stone sphere dropped from above and nearly crushed them, proving the dungeon had noticed their enthusiasm. In the narrow corridor, Drago stepped forward and told Setsuna to leave the defense to him. Blue energy formed a blade in Drago's hand as the rolling sphere filled the passage. Drago shattered the stone trap with one strike, sending debris across the staircase while Setsuna watched the close combat answer work perfectly. Setsuna noticed Drago's high spirits, and Drago admitted he wanted the whole dungeon to recognize the strength of close combat. Drago added that he also refused to lose to Setsuna, turning cooperation into a friendly race. Setsuna smiled back, accepting the rivalry without slowing their advance. A trap suddenly triggered nearby, snapping Setsuna's expression from amusement to immediate alarm. An arrow flew past his head, making it clear that the deeper route was lined with mechanisms designed to punish impatience. Setsuna moved through the trapped corridor in a blue blur, dodging each trigger before it could chain into the next. He slashed through a magical barrier and cleared the path with precise movements instead of brute force. Drago realized that their reaction time and insight were operating on a completely different level from the other teams. He suggested clearing the remaining traps so the third-year students behind them could pass more safely. Then Drago spotted a treasure chest in the corridor and called Setsuna over. Drago reached toward the chest and channeled mana into its lock, treating the reward like another mechanical challenge. The magic wrapped around the chest and activated the hidden lock. Drago secured the chest and proudly announced that he had finally obtained one. Mifune appeared, accepted the chest from Drago, and instantly claimed 15 points for himself. Setsuna and Drago stared in shock as their hard-earned reward teleported directly into someone else's score. Drago clenched his fist and decided that the dungeon was not a treasure hunt anymore. It was a battle of speed. The pair dashed forward again, determined to reach the next objective before Mifune could appear. A stone wall blocked the route, so Drago prepared to solve another obstacle with close combat magic. His punch shattered the wall and opened another section of the dungeon. Drago stared into the newly revealed area and realized another chest was waiting beyond the broken stones. He reached for it with renewed determination, refusing to let Mifune steal the next reward. Mifune appeared again and claimed the points before Drago could finish, raising his score while Drago remained stuck behind. Drago's score stayed at 0, and his frustration finally became visible enough to light the corridor. He turned that frustration toward a suit of armor and engaged it with his magical blade. Drago kept attacking the metal opponent, using speed and power to gain control of the fight. Setsuna and Drago continued exploring together while the rest of the team watched the score race unfold around them. Drago swept his glowing blade across the armor and knocked a piece of it away. The score display showed Mifune leading with 40 points while Drago still had none, making every successful hit feel strategically useless. Drago and Yuzuha fought bat-like creatures and finally raised Drago's score to 10 while Yuzuha reached 30. Mifune claimed another chest and reached 55 points, leaving Drago shouting in the background. Mifune mocked Drago by admitting he was strong but lacked vision, which was a polite way of saying he kept arriving second. Drago ground his teeth and tried not to let the smug upperclassmen turn the training into a personal war. Setsuna reached 25 points while Drago had 10, and Drago argued that sharing rewards was supposed to be part of dungeon exploration. He confronted Mifune for stealing the younger student's points and asked whether that was really his strategy for success. Mifune's companion looked surprised by the accusation, but Mifune casually admitted that it was basically true. Mifune said he was not stupid enough to train only his muscles and challenged Drago to use others if the rules bothered him. He argued that humans used other people to reach their goals, then asked why Drago was angry at seeing the same method used against him. Mifune finished with a taunt about ability, while Setsuna privately admitted that the upperclassman was extremely sly. The team explained that Mifune could teleport using 2 different formation circles, making his reward theft almost impossible to prevent. Yuzuha kept casting spells and defeating monsters without seeming interested in her score, which made her behavior suspicious. Drago wondered whether Yuzuha was hiding a separate intention behind the casual way she ignored the competition. Mifune and Yuzuha pushed their totals to 80 and 50 points and announced that clearing the dungeon would be easy. Setsuna and Drago followed with 35 and 10 points, still far behind the upperclassmen's efficient scoring. Drago suddenly stopped because the room ahead felt different from every corridor they had crossed. He studied the chamber and confirmed that the air carried a deeper, stranger tension. Mifune spotted a chest resting on a throne and announced that he would gladly take it. Dark energy erupted as the chest began to open, turning the promised reward into a trap with an audience. Mifune's confidence vanished, and his expression shifted to shock. He shouted a warning and told everyone not to wait, because only idiots would stand beside that chest. A blast of dark energy fired from the chest and caught the group off guard. A monstrous shadow emerged, and Drago realized that this dungeon was already far beyond its advertised 1-star danger. The creature stood revealed as a skeletal king wrapped in a purple aura, turning the training exercise into a boss fight. Drago felt the monster's immense power and understood that something was seriously wrong with the dungeon. The hidden chamber held a skeletal king of death, and Setsuna faced it with the uncomfortable feeling that the dungeon had skipped several difficulty levels. The undead king raised its presence and commanded life itself to slumber. A companion stared in disbelief because the monster could speak, then shouted Setsuna's name as the spell began forming. Setsuna gathered blue mana and still found time to ask how many points the monster was worth. The King of Death answered with a complex purple magic circle that expanded above the team. A dark beam fired through the chamber, forcing Setsuna to choose between dodging and trying to break the spell. He lunged through the projectiles with his blue blade moving faster than the dark energy could track. Setsuna charged directly toward the magic circle, aiming to disrupt the source before the next spell finished casting. His teeth clenched as he committed to the strike, because hesitation would leave the entire team inside the spell's reach. Blue energy exploded from Setsuna's attack and collided with the king's dark magic in a blinding burst. Setsuna shielded his face while the backlash tore through the chamber. The King of Death ordered the surrounding magic circles to disappear, as if even its own spell network had become expendable. Setsuna watched the chaos with focused eyes, searching for the next opening instead of admiring the destruction. Purple energy swirled around him while he held the blue sword ready for the next command from the undead king. The dark current caught Setsuna and spun him through the chamber, forcing him to fight for balance before fighting the enemy. He dropped to one knee beside a glowing circle and tried to analyze or neutralize it directly. A sharp blue blade formed in his hand, giving Setsuna the precision he needed to cut through the dark spellwork. He swung hard and carved through the purple atmosphere, opening a temporary path for the team. A blonde companion strained under the magical pressure, proving that the King of Death's attack was affecting everyone at once. Setsuna reached toward the others and called for assistance, coordinating instead of trying to carry the entire fight alone. Setsuna and a companion joined hands, combining their power to resist the dark magic filling the room. A dark-haired teammate looked toward the ceiling as more purple circles appeared above them. The next blast struck her and threw her backward, turning the coordinated defense into another emergency. Setsuna rushed to her side and checked whether she could still move. She gave him a faint, reassuring smile despite the hit, refusing to make her condition another distraction. Setsuna looked back toward the King of Death and hardened his expression, because the team needed him to keep attacking. He swung the blue blade again and told everyone to do this together. A reddish-brown-haired companion watched from the stone corridor with a confident grin, ready to contribute to the chaotic plan. A light-haired companion answered with a mocking look, making the tense room feel like it contained a rivalry inside the crisis. Setsuna and Leo faced each other in the corridor, their conversation carrying the same tension as the fight around them. Leo pressed his hands together and feigned innocence, acting as though the danger was merely an amusing misunderstanding. Then he dropped the act and announced that he was just kidding. revealing the predatory grin underneath. Setsuna checked the dark metal band on his wrist and prepared his equipment for the next physical push. He adjusted a matching band around his ankle and activated its blue energy, turning the training device into another weapon. A memory returned of Setsuna failing to finish Leo in the past, reminding him why allowing another opening was unacceptable. The flashback showed the old defeat swallowed by force and darkness, adding urgency to every movement in the present. A metallic band was placed on the table, offering Setsuna a harsher way to build strength after completing his normal training. Setsuna stared at the device with interest, already calculating how much pain it could convert into speed. The band looked simple, but its geometric design suggested that its weight and magic were anything but ordinary. The older instructor warned against using it while Setsuna was still recovering. He continued explaining with the calm experience of someone who had seen ambitious students mistake pain for progress. Setsuna and his companion clenched their fists and chose to proceed anyway. When the band hit the stone floor, cracks spread beneath it and revealed the device's ridiculous weight. Leo looked shocked by the display, realizing Setsuna had been training with something capable of damaging the floor by simply falling. Back in the chamber, the King of Death sat on a throne surrounded by purple circles while Setsuna and the team gathered below. Dark beams fired from the circles, forcing Setsuna and his companion to dodge through the throne room. They activated Physical Boost and charged forward through the spellstorm. Setsuna lunged with his fist glowing blue, finally entering the range where close combat could decide the fight. His face stayed focused as he closed the distance despite the dark energy trying to force him back. Setsuna slipped past an incoming attack with fluid precision and kept his momentum. He drove a blue-charged punch toward the skeletal king and made the throne room shake. The blow connected and shattered the surrounding area, forcing the boss creature to recoil. A decaying claw wrapped in purple energy rose from the chaos, proving that the King of Death had not been finished by one strike. Setsuna lunged again over the glowing magic circle that powered the boss and drove his fist into its center. He gathered more blue energy in his hand and prepared a second attack before the dark magic could recover. Setsuna and his companion leaped together, coordinating their assault instead of competing for the same target. The purple magic circle below them pulsed as the foundation of the king's power. Their combined strike connected and shattered the chamber around the throne. Leo watched the impact with a shocked expression, finally seeing the team push the impossible boss backward. A massive purple explosion filled the room and erased every clear line between victory and another trap. When the energy settled, the boss slumped on its throne while a snake-like creature lay below it. Setsuna and his companions checked their equipment and scanned the chamber for the next problem. Leo looked pale and shaken, as if the aftermath had revealed something worse than the boss itself. Setsuna looked toward the throne and sensed that the situation was not finished just because the monster had stopped moving. His eyes widened when he noticed something unexpected in the room. The team searched the chamber and asked where the missing teammate had gone. The ground began trembling and cracking beneath them, turning the missing person question into a much more immediate problem. Leo leaped across a widening gap as the chamber started collapsing around the team. He and Setsuna reached for each other across the break, trying to keep the group from being separated. Their hands finally locked, giving the falling team 1 point of stability in a room coming apart beneath them. Leo looked down at the shadows with alarm when he saw movement rising below. Undead creatures emerged with red eyes glowing through the dark, surrounding every remaining path. Their decaying faces twisted with hunger as the horde gathered beneath the ledge. The wide chamber filled with undead, turning the dungeon's hidden floor into a sea of enemies. Setsuna raised both glowing hands and asked what in the world was happening inside this dungeon. The lower floor exploded into motion as a skeletal swarm rushed the exhausted team from every direction. Setsuna planted his feet and swung through the first line, buying the others enough space to breathe. Blue energy flashed between the students as they fought back together and cut an opening through the horde. The light-haired teammate stepped into that opening and struck another undead before it could surround them. But every clean hit cost more stamina, and the teammate's posture started to sag under the endless pressure. He was already breathing hard while Setsuna watched the dark cavern for the next wave instead of celebrating. Setsuna answered the swarm with one sweeping strike that smashed several skeletons aside at once. The victory lasted only a second because more red eyes crawled through the darkness behind the fallen bodies. Setsuna exhaled into the cold air and assessed the numbers, realizing the dungeon was producing enemies faster than they could finish them. He stood among the defeated skeletons and searched for the next threat, already expecting the floor to move again. The red-haired teammate kept swinging while the light-haired one shouted through his fatigue, turning panic into a rough battle rhythm. Then Setsuna's eye caught something beyond the horde, and his focus snapped toward a detail the others had missed. He looked over his shoulder as the air changed, carrying a pressure that felt completely different from ordinary undead magic. The light-haired teammate struck backward without taking his eyes off the disturbance, and the sudden fear in his face said enough. Setsuna lunged with his blade, trying to stop the shift before it could become another attack on the team. The red-haired teammate was knocked away and demanded to know what was happening as the formation broke apart. Setsuna and the light-haired teammate exchanged a tense look, both understanding that brute force alone was no longer enough. Setsuna gave the order to hold the line and watch the source, because cutting down bodies would not solve a problem that kept returning. The skeletal enemies closed in again, their empty faces pressing the team toward the deeper corridor. The light-haired teammate gritted his teeth, frustrated that exhaustion was turning every defense into a delay instead of a solution. Even so, the three blades moved in coordination and cleared another lane through the mass. They regrouped with weapons raised, waiting for the next impact while the cavern groaned around them. The team began walking through the dim passage, and every step toward the exit felt like an invitation for something worse to appear. A huge shadow rose ahead of them, turning the corridor into a doorway for a boss-sized problem. Setsuna faced the looming shape from behind, calm enough to prepare but not foolish enough to underestimate it. He pushed blue energy into the dark organic mass and tried to suppress the corruption before it could spread through the chamber. The light-haired teammate watched the attempt with a calculating stare, measuring whether Setsuna's power was actually reaching the source. The mass answered with another sudden skirmish, forcing the team to swing again before the suppression could finish. A coordinated attack landed, and the system rewarded Setsuna with 10 points, proving the dungeon still counted their kills like this was a normal lesson. A red eye opened inside the organic darkness, and the undead started moving again, as if the source had never been damaged. One teammate suggested they keep beating down the undead to release the pressure, but the joke sounded more desperate than funny. A hand tightened around a blade while magical markings glowed, showing that everyone was preparing for a longer fight than expected. Setsuna and his teammate compared the danger in low voices, each admitting that the other might be the only reason they survived the next wave. The light-haired teammate answered with a nervous smile, trying to turn the fear into confidence before it became paralysis. A female teammate smiled in a way that felt too calm for the situation, leaving Setsuna with the impression that someone was hiding part of the plan. Later, Setsuna stood alone in the darkness with a red glow behind him, quietly watching the dungeon instead of trusting the silence. His profile hardened as the pieces connected. The undead were not the real enemy, only the visible symptom of something deeper. When the team gathered again, Setsuna looked from face to face and kept his suspicion close while the others prepared to move. The brown-haired teammate raised a blue aura and braced for another charge, ready to convert the approaching horde into more points. His first strike dropped an undead and added 5 points to the running total. A second hit followed immediately, another 5 points appearing while the team kept its formation intact. The fight became a rapid montage of blades, blue flashes, and repeated 5-point rewards as the students cleared the passage. Their attacks overlapped cleanly, turning individual fatigue into a coordinated machine that the undead could not break. The brown-haired teammate delivered the final blow in the wave and left the corridor briefly quiet. The team stood amid defeated undead, but the silence felt like a pause before the dungeon revealed its next trick. A glowing hand checked the magical status display, turning the exhausted battle into a quick accounting of points and remaining strength. Setsuna listened without lowering his guard, already comparing the numbers with the danger surrounding them. Mifune's total reached 125 points, a respectable score that suddenly felt meaningless beside the dungeon's corruption. The brown-haired teammate looked strained, proving that even a good score could not hide how close everyone was to their limit. Setsuna scanned the environment and noticed the walls were carrying the same uneasy pressure as the dark mass. The light-haired teammate checked the device on his wrist, searching for a route or signal that could lead them out. He pointed at the display while Setsuna studied it, and the device's reading gave the team a new reason to stop arguing about points. They crowded around the device and compared its warning with the dark energy leaking through the corridor. The light-haired teammate's concern deepened when the signal refused to settle, as if the dungeon itself was interfering with their escape. The team moved again with the light-haired teammate leading, but his worried glance kept returning to the device. The brown-haired teammate followed nervously, listening to every sound behind them. Setsuna felt an ominous presence swell through the passage and turned toward a dark aura that had not been there moments earlier. The students discussed the energy in quick whispers, trying to decide whether it was a trap, a monster, or a warning. The brown-haired teammate looked alarmed as the pressure grew stronger instead of fading behind them. Setsuna listened to the reports, weighing the safest path against the possibility that the source was already moving. The light-haired teammate looked distressed and finally admitted that staying inside any longer could put the entire class at risk. He urged them to reach the exit and report everything to Giovanni before the dungeon's abnormal energy spread beyond its walls. Setsuna considered the exit, knowing that retreat was sensible but also knowing the source might follow them out. They started toward the passageway, then stopped when an ominous sound rolled through the stone behind them. Setsuna gritted his teeth, recognizing the sound as the kind of warning that arrived before the next disaster. The light-haired teammate clutched his head as dark energy twisted around him, suddenly making his own body part of the threat. A teammate put a steadying hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him anchored while the corruption pressed against his mind. The brown-haired teammate insisted they find Yuzuha and leave together, refusing to turn escape into another person left behind. The light-haired teammate looked overwhelmed, caught between the need to run and the dark force using his fear against him. They climbed the stairs toward the exit, hoping that higher ground would finally put distance between them and the corrupted floor. The group paused again when the feeling of being hunted followed them up the stairwell. The brown-haired teammate stepped forward with a determined expression, ready to turn around if the presence appeared. The light-haired teammate warned them that the danger was close, and this time nobody treated the warning as nerves. Setsuna pointed toward a side of the corridor and said the dark energy was coming from over there. The team ran as a mysterious figure appeared behind them and began casting a spell through the darkness. A man turned toward them in shock, framed by red light as if he had been caught in the middle of becoming someone else. His eye twisted into something grotesque, and the transformation stripped away the last ordinary trace of his expression. Purple light crawled through a withered hand and veins, showing the corruption had already taken control of his body. The hooded figure knelt in the ruined passage and begged them to save him, leaving Setsuna with a new enemy that sounded like a victim. The team tried to flee the corridor, but Setsuna triggered an ancient purple circle and was dragged to the floor screaming. A companion turned toward the disturbance in shock, realizing the dungeon had found a new way to punish their escape attempt. Vein-like marks spread around Setsuna's eye, showing that the trap was not simply holding the body in place, it was changing it. The same corruption crawled along Setsuna's arm, while the hand trembled violently inside the magic circle. Setsuna reached out in agony as purple energy surged higher, and the others realized waiting would cost more than stamina. The light-haired adventurer watched with a desperate expression, unable to help without risking the trap spreading to another person. Drago moved toward Setsuna, but a teammate shouted for him to stop, because getting close could activate the ancient magic again. The group stood around the circle and finally understood that they had not found a shortcut. They had stepped into a prepared dungeon trap. The dark archway behind them offered no comfort, its empty entrance looking more like the mouth of a second disaster. A memory surfaced of a small box holding 3 strange red objects, suggesting the trap was connected to a plan made long before the team arrived. The blue-eyed protagonist stared at Setsuna with a serious expression and decided that hesitation was now the most dangerous option. He stood beside Drago and measured the circle while the team waited for someone to find a way through its defenses. A blue magical blade formed in his hand, and its shape made the plan obvious. Cut the trap instead of touching the person inside it. The blade struck the center of the purple circle and detonated the stored energy around Setsuna. As the magic dissipated, Setsuna sagged with relief and exhaustion, finally free from the circle's direct grip. The protagonist caught Setsuna before the body hit the ground and pulled the injured teammate away from the remaining sparks. He held Setsuna close and vowed not to let the corruption carry the situation any further. Dark smoke still leaked around Setsuna's blue earring, proving the trap had left something behind even after the circle broke. The light-haired adventurer looked relieved for one breath, then returned to scanning the corridor for whatever had triggered the trap. The protagonist carried Setsuna on his back and moved with the group, refusing to leave the injured teammate behind. The adventurers regrouped around him and discussed how naturally the incident had happened, which made the trap feel even more deliberate. The light-haired adventurer pointed to a glowing mark on his wrist, suggesting the trap had affected more than the person caught inside the circle. The mark pulsed close to the skin, carrying the same unsettling magical pattern that had surrounded Setsuna. The protagonist examined the mark while still carrying Setsuna, trying to learn whether it was a warning, a key, or another delayed attack. A bracelet reacted to the glowing mark, linking the device to the dungeon's strange mechanism. Drago watched the investigation with a serious expression, realizing the team had not yet escaped the trap's consequences. Then the walls shook and the ceiling began to crumble, as if breaking the circle had awakened the entire dungeon. Drago shouted as stone dropped around them, forcing everyone to move before the corridor became a sealed tomb. The protagonist raised his magical power and protected the group from the falling debris while keeping Setsuna secured. The light-haired adventurer panicked as the collapse accelerated, and every possible route seemed to disappear. Rocks crashed across the dungeon, and the protagonist watched the destruction from behind, with the grim understanding that the exit was no longer simple. A companion cleared a path with a glowing blue fist, but the protagonist kept studying the rubble, instead of wasting power on a passage that might collapse again. He explained that brute force would only bring more stone down, so the team needed a safer route through the damaged dungeon. A female adventurer called for help while the others stared at the blocked corridor and realized their time was shrinking. They climbed over falling rocks and reached for gaps between the debris, searching for any opening that led away from the collapse. The protagonist clasped a companion's hand in the chaos, turning a dangerous crossing into a brief promise that nobody would be left alone. The female adventurer used a green magical item to support a fallen teammate while the rest of the group tried to keep the rubble from closing in. Sweat ran down her face as she maintained the magic, spending precious strength to keep the injured fighter moving. The group squeezed into a small dark space and admitted what nobody wanted to say. This was not supposed to happen during training. They could remove some rubble, but the air was already growing thin, and their exhausted bodies could not keep digging forever. A companion's tired face showed how quickly the collapse was turning a combat problem into a survival problem. The protagonist breathed heavily as the shrinking air reached even him, but he kept looking for the cause instead of accepting defeat. The team rested in the darkness, exhausted and defeated, while the dungeon continued to groan around their hiding place. The protagonist stood apart and studied the others, knowing that the next decision had to save more than his own life. Resignation appeared on a companion's face, as the lack of air made escape seem less likely by the minute. The protagonist explained that the earthquakes probably meant the dungeon boss had awakened, while a stronger magic blocked their teleportation. The team reacted with shock because the dungeon's difficulty had increased while they were already trapped beneath the ruins. They searched for a solution, but every option led back to the same questions: fight the boss, wait for rescue, or suffocate in place. Setsuna's protector finally made the choice for everyone, and promised that he would save them all. A monster with glowing red eyes emerged from the shadows, answering the promise by presenting the dungeon's boss. The protagonist attacked with magical force, refusing to give the creature time to trap the group inside the collapsing chamber. The enemy split into smaller, shadowy forms, turning one target into a crowd that rushed him from every side. He walked through the defeated shadows, but the victory did not feel clean because a strange heat had begun burning inside him. A falling rock made him turn, and the sound reminded him that the dungeon was still collapsing even while he fought. Something small floated in the distance, offering a mysterious clue inside a room that should have contained only rubble and monsters. The protagonist returned to the resting group and approached with the strange object still in hand. A companion looked up in surprise and called out to Drago, relieved that someone had returned through the dangerous passage. The protagonist held up the paper-like object, revealing the only clear lead they had found since the collapse began. From behind the rubble, he called to ask whether anyone was on the other side of the blocked corridor. A voice answered that they were there, proving the collapse had separated more survivors than the group initially realized. A reddish-brown-haired companion looked toward the protagonist with urgency, trapped but still ready to help clear the obstruction. She pressed against the rubble and searched for a route through while the heavy air made every movement harder. The protagonist took charge and ordered everyone to remove the rubble together before the remaining air ran out. As they worked, the atmosphere grew heavier, warning that the boss's presence was approaching even through the stone. The protagonist advanced with his blue sword drawn and reached a glowing green doorway buried deeper in the dungeon. His expression tightened as he prepared for the encounter beyond the doorway, where the strange heat inside him continued to build. The entrance to the boss chamber opened with an eerie glow, making it clear the dungeon had been leading him here. He stepped inside with the blue sword lighting the dark, ready to meet the force that had blocked their escape. The protagonist stood alone at the threshold and hardened his stance, while something massive moved beyond the shadows. A dark entity erupted from the ground and filled the chamber with a purple aura that made the walls shudder. The boss announced itself with an explosion, sending debris across the room and forcing the protagonist into the air. He landed with the sword ready, refusing to let the spectacular entrance decide the opening exchange. Then the shape fully emerged, a double-headed hydra with glowing red eyes, giving the trapped team two monstrous targets instead of one. Setsuna faced the double-headed hydra in the ruined chamber, his cloak torn and his body already carrying the cost of the dungeon. The monster opened both jaws beneath a purple aura, making the boss room feel less like a test and more like an execution ground. A purple blast struck a nearby fighter, proving that the hydra could attack the whole team while Setsuna tried to hold its attention. Setsuna leaped above the creature and brought his blue sword down through the green and violet mist. He kept the aerial assault moving, using momentum to prevent either head from lining up an easy counterattack. The two heads tracked him through the mist, while Setsuna landed below, already searching for the pattern behind their movements. He drew a desperate breath, pushing his focus past the pain because one mistake would let both heads attack at once. Setsuna slashed across the hydra's front and forced the red-eyed heads to recoil from the blue blade. The next strike carved a bright trail through the darkness, but the monster kept its balance and answered with both necks. Setsuna made a decisive cut between the heads, yet the hydra's size absorbed the impact instead of ending the fight. He moved around the monster at incredible speed, landing precise attacks while refusing to stand in front of both mouths. The hydra lunged after him, and Setsuna leaped away just before its dark mass swallowed the space where he had been standing. He stopped at a distance and watched the creature rise from green magical liquid, realizing the arena itself was feeding the boss. Setsuna's feet touched down with blue energy, and his stance changed from frantic survival to controlled close combat. He dashed forward again, sword trailing light as he targeted the hydra before it could recover its rhythm. A heavy slash struck one head, and the creature twisted to protect the other with its dark aura. Setsuna followed with another cut, refusing to let the damaged head pull the battle into a slow exchange. The blade flashed again, but the Hydra continued defending with both heads while its red eyes stayed locked on Setsuna. Setsuna struck with perfect timing and briefly caught both heads inside the same attack line. He circled the monster faster than it could turn, using agility to turn its size into a weakness. The Hydra lunged once more, forcing Setsuna backward while its dark form tried to pin him against the chamber wall. Sweat ran down Setsuna's face as he measured the cost of the fight and kept his eyes sharp for the one opening that mattered. The Hydra gathered purple energy around both heads, preparing an attack that would be impossible to dodge if Setsuna misread the timing. Setsuna took another sharp breath and forced his exhausted body to stay responsive. He sat in a brief meditative posture, with the blue sword in one hand and magic gathering in the other, compressing panic into control. A bandaged hand shaped a blue flame, showing how precisely Setsuna could still control power despite the damage from the battle. Blue flames formed in both hands as he prepared a stronger technique rather than continuing to trade single cuts with a regenerating boss. The preparation was interrupted when a muscular professor entered and caught Setsuna in the middle of his dangerous concentration. The professor grinned at the display, evaluating the student's progress as if the Hydra fight were also an unexpected lesson. Setsuna looked up through the sweat, exhausted but unwilling to let the interruption pull his attention away from the monster. For a moment, he returned to a bandaged resting position and gathered the strength needed to continue the real battle. The scene snapped back to the boss chamber, where the Hydra waited inside dark purple flames and the rescue clock kept running. Blue blades formed around his hands as he prepared to expand that single sword plan into a synchronized finishing attack. He lunged toward one head and cut across its guard before the Hydra could launch another breath of purple energy. Setsuna drove the attack with a clenched fist and concentrated every bit of close combat power into the blade. He slipped around the monster's reach, keeping his blue energy separate from the Hydra's dark aura by inches. Then, Setsuna closed the distance completely and committed to striking the body, instead of waiting for a perfect long-range opening. A sweeping attack forced him into the air, but Setsuna used the motion to pass over the Hydra's dark energy. He landed with blue power gathered in his hand and stayed ready for the counterattack. His breathing grew rough, yet his eyes remained locked on the target because fatigue could not be allowed to choose the timing. The blade sliced through the Hydra and sprayed green fluid across the dark chamber. The wounded monster rose above him with its aura intensifying, demonstrating that damage alone was not enough to keep it down. Setsuna narrowed his eyes and recalculated, finally treating the regeneration as the central puzzle instead of a side effect. The Hydra's shape shifted and revealed a skeletal, hooded figure inside the darkness, exposing the core behind the monster's body. Setsuna dashed away from the next attack, buying a breath while the hidden core reshaped the creature around itself. He exhaled slowly and prepared for one decisive effort instead of letting the battle stretch until the team ran out of air. Setsuna charged back with blue energy flaring, now aiming to strike both vital points before the Hydra could recover either one. The impact created a shockwave that shook the chamber and forced the monster's two heads into the same line. Setsuna leaped over the Hydra and positioned his blades above the necks, turning the boss's own size against it. He landed a precise crossing strike that cut through both defenses before either head could pull away. Both heads were severed at the same time, and the purple aura finally began dissolving instead of rebuilding. Setsuna delivered the final blue-powered blow into the exposed core and ended the Hydra's last chance to revive. He stood over the defeated boss with a calm expression, victorious but still listening for the team trapped beyond the ruins. The Hydra's remains shattered across the chamber, and the dark energy vanished, leaving only broken stone and a dangerous silence. Setsuna understood the rule behind the victory. The Hydra's recovery stopped only because both heads had been cut together. His hand trembled from exhaustion, but before he could rest, a sharp clap echoed through the chamber. Gloved hands clapped again, announcing someone who had been watching the fight instead of helping the trapped students. Setsuna looked up, with dirt across his face and blue eyes already guarded for the next enemy. A hooded stranger praised the rumor that Setsuna had defeated Leo with one hit, confirming that the battle had been observed from the shadows. Setsuna stood his ground among the ruins while the stranger approached, refusing to give the newcomer the advantage of a frightened reaction. The hooded figure revealed Giovanni's face, complete with glasses, glowing yellow eyes, and the smug confidence of someone who believed the chamber belonged to him. Giovanni mocked Setsuna's calm and suggested that Setsuna had expected him, turning the encounter into a personal test instead of a random ambush. Setsuna answered seriously, measuring Giovanni while the remains of the Hydra cooled around them. Giovanni moved closer with a fluid, taunting step, enjoying the tension he had created inside the ruined boss chamber. Setsuna's body glowed faintly as he kept his guard raised, prepared to fight again, even though his strength was nearly spent. He demanded to know whether Giovanni was an apostle and why he had pushed the dungeon this far. Giovanni answered with a cold smile and let the silence carry the threat for him. His yellow eyes glinted behind the glasses as he continued enjoying the unanswered question. Setsuna lowered his gaze for a moment, processing the implication that the Hydra and the collapse had been connected to Giovanni. A scarred woman with one blind eye appeared and demanded to know whether everything had been part of Giovanni's plan. Giovanni explained that she wanted to become his ally, so he became her guide, while insisting he expected nothing from her. The mention of an ally brought another young woman's presence into the tense exchange, adding a personal history Setsuna did not yet understand. Giovanni's smug expression finally shifted into irritation when the conversation stopped following his preferred script. A fist clenched with anger, and someone ordered Giovanni to stop talking, breaking the balance of the confrontation. Blue energy ignited in Setsuna's eyes as he promised Giovanni would pay for every one of his sins. Setsuna could barely catch his breath after the Hydra fight, but Giovanni gave him no time to turn victory into rest. The cloaked team regrouped among the rocks, while Setsuna and Giovanni stood apart, making the ruined chamber their next battlefield. A hand gripped the debris as the trapped fighters searched for a path, while Setsuna prepared to keep the stronger threat away from them. Drago wore a confident smile while interacting with a teammate, but the rocky chamber still carried the tension of an unfinished fight. The dungeon remained dark and unstable, and the team thanked one another because simple survival had become the only reliable victory. They exchanged thanks for the help, but everyone understood that Setsuna was still facing the person who had created the disaster. Someone guessed that Setsuna had defeated the boss, and the returning mana signature from his bracelet soon confirmed it. The bracelet's mana signature came back online, giving the team proof that Setsuna was still moving inside the chamber. Relief spread through the group when the signal returned, even though the presence of Giovanni immediately replaced that relief with caution. A companion looked toward the next passage with determination, preparing to reach Setsuna before the enemy could finish whatever he had started. Layla promised to wait outside while the fighter went in, splitting the rescue effort so at least one route to safety remained open. The team thanked Layla and pushed forward, carrying the responsibility of finding Setsuna through the collapsing dungeon. A fighter ran into the chamber with a clear promise to intervene before the confrontation could turn into an execution. A subtle smile appeared on a waiting face, suggesting that the rescue party had entered exactly when someone wanted them to. A glowing mark trembled on a hand, reacting to the magic gathering around the battlefield. Setsuna stood in the corridor surrounded by blue energy, ready to fight even though every movement still carried the Hydra battle's exhaustion. Giovanni adjusted his glasses and challenged him with a confident smile, inviting Setsuna to prove whether close combat could reach him. Setsuna answered by lunging with a blue-powered fist, closing the distance before Giovanni could build a comfortable formation. Giovanni activated Frost Phantom, turning the air around his hand into a magical attack designed to punish a fighter who needed to get close. Ice shards formed around Setsuna, boxing him inside a defensive trap that made every direct route toward Giovanni dangerous. Setsuna's eyes widened when he sensed another attack coming from below, proving Giovanni's formation was not limited to the space in front of him. The ice attack struck and scattered shards across Setsuna's body, forcing him to absorb damage before finding a way out. Giovanni smiled because the magic was working exactly as intended against a close combat mage who needed a clean approach. Bloodied and injured, Setsuna recognized that the formation magic strengthened Giovanni's traps and counterattacks every time he rushed blindly. His mana was already nearly exhausted from the Hydra, leaving him with almost no reserve for a prolonged exchange. Setsuna studied Giovanni's formation and searched for the condition hidden inside the magic, instead of wasting another charge. He charged anyway, but this time he aimed for the moment before Giovanni could activate the next formation at the transport point. A blue fist drove forward and forced Giovanni to react, giving Setsuna a fraction of the timing he needed. The counter struck Setsuna with a poisonous effect, and he realized the curse was already moving through his body. A glowing blue attack hit him from behind and sent him staggering across the chamber. Setsuna fell to one knee with blood and ice around him, but the pain only clarified how quickly this fight had to end. Giovanni stood over him and ordered him to shut up, treating the wounded fighter as if the outcome had already been decided. With a sinister smile, Giovanni asked whether Setsuna knew how to break the curse he had placed on him. He grabbed Setsuna by the hair and forced him to look up, turning the question into a demonstration of control. Giovanni kept him pinned in that humiliating position, while explaining that the curse would only break if Setsuna accepted his condition. Setsuna rejected the idea of pledging himself to someone like Giovanni, even while the poison continued attacking his body. Giovanni answered with a massive blue ice blade and tried to finish the argument by cutting down the weakened fighter. Setsuna narrowly avoided the blade and moved toward a new angle, using the swirling energy as cover for his escape. He lunged again with energy in his hand, refusing to let Giovanni reset the formation between attacks. Setsuna struck with a glowing blade and forced the enemy's defense into a direct clash. Giovanni's eyes widened when the attack landed, revealing the first real gap in his confident control. Setsuna pressed the advantage with a relentless barrage and drove Giovanni backward through the ruined chamber. The struggle knocked Giovanni's glasses and glove away, stripping off the polished facade he had used to intimidate the room. Giovanni smiled despite losing ground and admitted that Setsuna was fast, as if the danger had finally become entertaining. His arm began transforming into a bark-like monstrous limb, revealing that the curse was not only a weapon aimed at Setsuna. Setsuna stared at the transformation and decided that killing Giovanni might be the only way to stop the ritual completely. Giovanni laughed with the monstrous arm exposed, enjoying the moment when the battle stopped pretending to be human. Blood ran down Setsuna's face, but the blue fire in his eyes stayed fixed on the enemy. The two fighters faced one another across the ruins, each preparing for the exchange that would decide whether the formation survived. Giovanni extended the transformed hand and mocked Setsuna with an order to surrender. Setsuna answered with silence, keeping the cold focus of a fighter who had already chosen not to retreat. He gathered what remained of his strength and prepared one final desperate attack through the poison and exhaustion. Blood streamed across Setsuna's face as he committed to the strike, making the attack a decision rather than a gamble. Giovanni activated a dark magic circle and restricted Setsuna's movement, finally forcing him into the type of formation he had been avoiding. Purple energy gathered in Giovanni's hands while the trap tightened around Setsuna. Massive dark spikes rained down through the circle and filled every escape route with lethal angles. Setsuna looked up in shock, then raised his own energy before the spikes could finish closing the trap. Blue power shattered the dark spikes and created a short opening in Giovanni's formation. Setsuna's battered face showed the cost of the counter, but his eyes remained steady because the formation had finally revealed its weakness. He crouched amid floating crystals and a glowing purple circle, recognizing that Giovanni's ritual needed the battlefield itself to remain intact. A red-haired companion rushed toward Setsuna in distress, arriving just as the ritual began to destabilize. Setsuna and the companion exchanged urgent words, coordinating around the few seconds before Giovanni could rebuild the formation. The companion looked shocked by how badly Setsuna had been pushed, but still stayed close enough to interfere. Setsuna smiled faintly after realizing that Giovanni's repeated losses were becoming more frequent, not less. Giovanni touched his chin and admitted that the ritual had been interrupted, finally acknowledging the opening Setsuna had created. He addressed the red-haired companion with a mocking surprise, blaming the unexpected intervention for disrupting his control. Setsuna and the companion stayed alert, refusing to let Giovanni turn the interruption into another chance to reset the battlefield. The companion demanded to know why such a monster existed, voicing the question everyone had been avoiding. Setsuna analyzed Giovanni's movement and noticed that teleportation could reposition him, but probably could not be used continuously. Giovanni examined his own hand and prepared another move, unaware that Setsuna had begun treating the teleportation limit as a timer. Setsuna and his companion crossed the battlefield quickly and forced Giovanni to spend that next movement defensively. Giovanni grimaced when the approach succeeded, realizing that his distance was no longer protecting him. Setsuna lunged with a fist filled by intense blue energy and turned the opening into a direct assault. He declared that the attack was not just an ordinary strike, revealing the close combat technique he had been saving for Giovanni. The blow connected and released a massive burst of energy that overwhelmed Giovanni's defense. Setsuna shouted through the pain and rage, promising to end the fight before Giovanni could rebuild the ritual. The blue attack sent Giovanni flying backward across the chamber. Setsuna followed with another precise strike, refusing to give the enemy time to stand or teleport away. His bloodied hand continued glowing as he poured the last of his energy into the assault. Giovanni slammed into a rock wall, his body broken against the stone and apparently defeated. The companion rushed to Setsuna and called his name, worried that the fighter had spent everything just to land the final blow. But Giovanni was still alive and reached out with a clawed hand for one last malicious action. Dark energy gathered in that hand as Giovanni prepared to attack the exhausted group from the ground. Setsuna could barely lift his head, questioning why the companion had allowed the enemy to reach this point. The companion stared in horror, unable to accept that Giovanni had survived the assault. Giovanni answered with hatred and swore that he would never forgive Setsuna. Then the human disguise tore away and revealed Giovanni's true monstrous mouth. A massive mutated form rose inside the purple aura, ending the battle's first phase by revealing that Giovanni himself was the real monster. A battered companion stared at Giovanni's new shape in disbelief, because the enemy who had looked human had become something that should never have been in the dungeon. Red particles drifted through the darkness, while Giovanni promised that he would never forgive Setsuna. The monster opened a huge toothy maw and pushed a long blue tongue through the purple aura surrounding its body. Its full form rose as a muscular beast with blade-like arms and a tail, turning the defeated human into a new boss entirely. Setsuna looked over the injured fighter lying on the ground and recognized that both the monster and the collapsing room were about to kill them. The wounded fighter warned that if this continued, neither of them would survive the chamber. Setsuna's blue eye focused on a presence in the flames, sensing something that did not belong to Giovanni's purple corruption. A vision of an outstretched figure and an elderly man surfaced like a spiritual connection, pointing Setsuna toward an older power. Bloodied and exhausted, Setsuna reached for a small flame on the ground, as if it were the last lifeline left in the chamber. He pleaded with the spirit inside the flame to lend him power, because returning empty-handed would leave his friends facing the monster alone. The flame answered by pulling Setsuna's awareness into a vast, red, starry void. He floated among broken rocks in the strange dimension and searched for an exit, unsure whether he had been transported or swallowed. Setsuna steadied himself in the red void and prepared for a confrontation with whatever power had answered his request. A massive, fiery creature with horns and glowing eyes appeared above him, making the new dimension feel even less survivable than the dungeon. Setsuna compared the creature to a titan, already understanding that the body in front of him represented a completely different scale of power. Its mana was aggressively hot, so hostile that simply standing near it felt like stepping into an attack. A boot stepped onto the red ground, marking the start of a confrontation that the spirit had no intention of making polite. Setsuna faced the creature with a serious expression and tried to explain why he had entered its dimension. The fiery creature crossed its arms and looked down at him, as if a human request were barely worth hearing. The creature opened its jaws and told him not to be arrogant, turning the negotiation into a challenge. Setsuna leaped through the void to avoid the first attack, proving the spirit would test him with force before listening to words. The fiery creature prepared another blast while Setsuna looked up and searched for a way to survive long enough to speak. Fire engulfed him, and Setsuna shielded his face as the spirit made the entire dimension feel like a furnace. The creature questioned why it should listen to a human who had entered its world only to ask for convenience. Massive fiery fists crashed down toward Setsuna and erased the distance between a conversation and a full execution attempt. The impact caught him and drove him through the heat, leaving him struggling to remain upright. Setsuna panted and reached outward, admitting that the fear of the spirit was real but refusing to let that fear decide the outcome. The creature loomed above him and declared that it had no obligation to listen to anything he said. Fiery pressure slammed Setsuna into the ground and pinned him beneath the spirit's overwhelming aura. Debris floated through the flames while Setsuna remained trapped, his body unable to rise against the force pressing down. His face twisted in agony as he felt himself drowning in flames and losing the ability to keep his thoughts organized. The creature explained that this realm was supposed to be cold, then promised to turn it into a hellish furnace and burn him alive. Setsuna screamed as the flames consumed the space around him, knowing that if he failed to persuade the spirit, everything outside would end with him. The creature noted that an ordinary human would already have lost consciousness, yet Setsuna continued resisting the heat. A glowing symbol appeared on Setsuna's chest as he reached for another connection and forced his fading awareness to stay present. The creature sensed the spirit of time inside the disturbance and questioned why Setsuna had invoked a power that did not belong to him. Setsuna pleaded for the spirit to listen, making the request about the friends waiting in the burning dungeon instead of his own survival. The creature called him a troublesome brat and remained unmoved by the plea. Then its eyes narrowed, realizing Setsuna's resistance was tied to something larger than his own stubbornness. A mysterious armored figure with red eyes appeared nearby, adding another presence to the spirit's already crowded judgment. The fiery creature looked at the surrounding figures and complained that all of them were becoming annoying. Setsuna declared that he had come to defeat everyone standing in his way, even though the flames were already tearing through his strength. The creature roared and asked what a human could possibly do against it. It promised that the dimension was infinite and that Setsuna would burn forever no matter how many times he struggled. The spirit gathered its heat for another strike, preparing to turn the threat into an immediate ending. Its massive teeth filled the darkness as the creature moved in to attack. The creature ordered Setsuna to prove himself if he wanted to survive the dimension. A pillar of fire erupted around him and swallowed Setsuna at the center of the spirit's final test. He screamed through the heat as his body began losing the strength to breathe or even remain conscious. Setsuna fought to keep his thoughts together while the flames tried to erase every sense except pain. His hand reached through the fire, grasping at empty air for something that could anchor him to the reason he had come. As consciousness drifted, Setsuna thought about the real world and the friends still trapped beyond the spirit dimension. A skeletal figure emerged from a jagged red portal, adding another nightmare to the dimension just as Setsuna's awareness began slipping away. Dark spikes pushed through a hand as the pressure forced his body toward another painful transformation. Setsuna looked upward through the chaos and pleaded for power one more time, his eyes glowing blue against the fire. The fiery spirit snarled with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, as if the continued resistance had finally become a challenge it respected. Setsuna knelt shirtless and exhausted in the burning landscape while the horned spirit watched from a throne of rock. The creature mocked him for going this far just to save his friends, recognizing the motive that had kept him alive. Its expression stayed almost unimpressed, but the spirit was now studying Setsuna instead of simply trying to erase him. Setsuna stood defensively amid the flames, while the creature observed that the human had finally lost consciousness. The spirit repeated the judgment, looking down at the unconscious fighter, as if waiting to see whether his will could return. In the fiery wasteland, Setsuna's body remained alone among floating rocks as the dimension began preparing to release him. A final command ordered him to silence the annoying people outside, turning the spirit's permission into a dangerous responsibility. A golden sigil appeared on a hand, marking the transfer of a power or pact that Setsuna had earned by surviving the furnace. A man in a white cloak was struck in the neck by the returning burst of power, and blood sprayed across the ruined chamber. The wounded man stared in shock as pain replaced the exhaustion of holding the defensive line. He stood bleeding while the purple-flamed entity loomed in front of him, ready to finish the person he had been protecting. The entity's red eyes and monstrous grin made the threat clear. Giovanni had not been slowed for long. The man in the cloak sweated under the pressure and kept facing the monster despite having almost no defense left. The entity promised to kill the brat being protected after dealing with the wounded man, widening the danger back toward Setsuna. It mocked the two fighters and told them to get along well as corpses. The cloaked man realized he could no longer use his main guard, leaving the next attack almost impossible to block. A proud voice remembered Drago, giving the exhausted fighter one final emotional reason to keep standing. Drago apologized to his father for failing to protect his friend, even as the monster prepared to strike again. Purple energy crashed into the ground and the entity paused, curious about the change that had interrupted its attack. The monstrous figure towered over the chamber, while Setsuna looked up from behind, facing the threat that the new power had brought him back to confront. The entity roared between the ruined pillars, waiting for Setsuna to reveal whether the fire spirit's gift had actually changed the fight. Setsuna stared at the grotesque form, and questioned what kind of transformation could produce a monster this far beyond the original Giovanni. Giovanni's pale monster stared in shock as red-orange fire burst through the purple aura it had believed would control the entire chamber. The flames swirled with enough force to announce that Setsuna had returned from the spirit dimension carrying something the monster did not understand. Setsuna stood wrapped in fire while a wounded companion watched from behind, his eyes now glowing with the spirit's heat. The ruined chamber came back into view, as Setsuna's fiery energy cut through the darkness and Giovanni disappeared from the monster's immediate reach. Setsuna faced the towering beast with flames around his body, turning the monster's purple blades into targets instead of automatic death sentences. A blade-like arm slammed down, but Setsuna intercepted it with fire and created a violent clash of opposite energies. The impact shattered debris across the chamber as Setsuna's flames began overwhelming the monster's defensive aura. He drove a flame-infused punch into the monster and sent the massive body crashing into the ground. The monster looked up in terror, unable to understand how a human attack had suddenly become powerful enough to break its balance. Purple energy twisted around the monster as it tried to recover, but its aura now shook under the pressure of Setsuna's fire. Setsuna stood ready with the magical seal glowing on his fist, calm enough to finish the fight if the power obeyed him. The seal burned across his hand while intense flames gathered around it, turning a close combat strike into a concentrated weapon. The monster stared with its mouth open, finally recognizing that the battle had moved beyond its original calculations. Setsuna walked toward the cowering creature, his controlled fire making the monster's chaotic purple aura look even more unstable. The monster trembled and questioned whether it was actually afraid of a human, unable to accept what its body was telling it. Its jagged teeth showed through a panting mouth as fear turned into a physical struggle to keep the monster's form together. Rage and terror twisted across the monster's face as it prepared one final attack instead of surrendering to the new power. The dark aura expanded above Setsuna while the creature compressed an enormous blast and tried to reverse the fight in one move. A swirling ball of dark energy formed between the monster's hands, crackling with enough power to destroy the damaged chamber. Setsuna reached forward with a steady hand and prepared to answer the dark attack with a fire technique of his own. The monster released a focused beam and claimed that no living being could possibly withstand it. Setsuna cut into the beam with precise flames, splitting the dark energy instead of trying to absorb its full force. The monster's eyes widened as its strongest attack failed to stop the human walking through it. Setsuna's fiery strike carved a path through the defense and carried the heat directly toward the monster's core. The monster panicked and demanded to know where Setsuna had obtained that power. The strike connected and sent the monster flying backward, while its purple aura shattered under the impact. Setsuna stood amid the fading flames with a cold, calculated expression, as if the battle had become a simple problem to solve. The weakened monster looked up with awe and terror, finally understanding that the gap between them had reversed. It mocked Setsuna's control and claimed the new power was still too unstable to use properly. The monster called him an idiot for losing consciousness during battle and raised its blade-like arm for a counterattack. The blade struck the unconscious Setsuna and sent him flying through the chamber. Giovanni's monster watched his movements and wondered whether Setsuna was acting on instinct even without consciousness. It formed sharp spikes and prepared to impale him before the uncontrolled fire could awaken again. Setsuna shouted as if he had landed a direct hit, unaware of the injuries accumulating while the fire moved through his body. The monster admitted that the power was worth noting, then dismissed Setsuna as a human trapped among dragons, It raised the transformed arm and promised to sever Setsuna's head to prove that an undead body remained superior to a human one. A flash of blue energy cut through the darkness and interrupted the attack before the blade reached Setsuna. The monster turned in surprise, caught off guard by the sudden defense from someone it had not expected to still be standing. A boot planted firmly on the ground, announcing the arrival of a new fighter between Setsuna and the monster. Setsuna's companion arrived in time and raised a blade to shield the injured fighter from the next strike. The companion apologized for being late and promised not to let the monster take Setsuna away. The monster prepared to end the fight swiftly, refusing to let the rescue change its advantage for long. The companion faced it with a focused expression and accepted the impossible job of holding the line alone. She vowed to protect Setsuna as best she could, placing her body between him and the monster's killing blow. Inside the strange ethereal space, Setsuna opened his eyes and wondered whether the spirit dimension had pulled him back again. The fiery entity mocked him for being swallowed by such a low level of flame, treating his uncontrolled power as an embarrassing mistake. Setsuna noticed Layla in the strange space and asked about her, but the entity denied knowing anything about her. He begged the entity to explain how to control the fire and return to the real world, but the spirit told him to find the answer himself. Setsuna's eyes hardened with new resolve, transforming the spirit's refusal into the final instruction he needed. Back in the chamber, the monster swung at the companion who was barely holding the defensive line. The blade struck and made the companion wince, but she kept the weapon raised instead of stepping away from Setsuna. The monster continued its assault, and forced her to defend against attack after attack without a chance to counter. Its feral form prepared another strike, sensing that the protector was close to collapse. The next hit drew blood and pushed the companion backward across the ruined floor. She fell injured and exhausted while Setsuna remained trapped in the trance between the spirit's fire and the real battle. Even from the ground, she reached towards Setsuna and reminded him of what he had told her before. Setsuna's resolve answered from inside the trance. Even someone like him could become stronger if the determination in his heart remained alive. His eyes flared with light as the fire stopped behaving like an invading force and began answering his will. A warm memory returned of a woman telling a young boy not to rush, because a resolved heart would eventually grow stronger. The memory snapped against the sight of the wounded companion bleeding in the chamber, pulling Setsuna's new resolve back toward the present. A roaring fire filled the darkness as the monster demanded to be entertained more, unaware that Setsuna had finally found control. A demonic face emerged from the flames with yellow eyes and a grin, revealing how much the enemy enjoyed the suffering around it. The fire intensified across the chamber, turning the monster's taunts into a wall of heat between the fighters. The demonic entity announced that it would be the one to end Setsuna, then surged forward through the flames. A focused pillar of fire erupted from the attack and gave Setsuna only a heartbeat to stabilize his footing. The purple-flamed monster swept its bladed limbs toward the already injured fighter, trying to end the battle before the new power settled. Its scarred face and hollow eyes twisted with malice as the monster committed to the finishing exchange. Setsuna planted his boot between freezing ice and encroaching flames, stabilizing the body that had nearly collapsed. He grabbed the monster by the head with both hands wrapped in fire, finally turning close combat into control over the transformed enemy. Inferno Blaze detonated from the point of impact and blasted the monster away, ending the chapter with Setsuna's first fully controlled fire technique. Chiron stood inside the dying Inferno and answered the spirit's belief in immortality. Humans may have limited time, but that limit is exactly what gives their resolve force. His eyes burned with the memory of reaching the edge of death, the moment when he finally grasped the spirit's power. Chiron extended his hand and controlled the flames instead of letting them consume him, proving Inferno Blaze was more than a lucky explosion. He stood among the ruins with his clothes torn and his arms still glowing, composed only because the battle had finally stopped moving. The fire receded and left Chiron to inspect the damage, searching the dark chamber for the teammates who had survived beside him. He turned toward a voice or movement off-screen, still listening for danger even after Giovanni's monster had been blasted away. Layla appeared covered in dirt and blood, exhausted and traumatized after holding the defensive line, while Chiron was unconscious. Chiron looked at her with genuine concern and checked whether the person who protected him could still stand. He reassured Layla that everything would be all right now, finally allowing the tension in the ruined chamber to loosen. Chiron thanked her for protecting him and asked about her wounds while another injured survivor watched from the background. Layla answered with a weak smile, relieved that Chiron was alive even though the fight had left both of them barely functional. Chiron looked thoughtful and weary, already understanding that the victory had created more questions than it had solved. His eye widened as a sudden realization hit, interrupting the quiet before the body could recover from the new power. Chiron stumbled and caught himself with the glowing hand, the seal warning that Inferno Blaze had taken more from him than the explosion showed. He collapsed face first onto the ground, and the exhausted survivors could do nothing except call for help. People rushed up the stone staircase toward the fallen team, bringing the first real rescue response into the ruined dungeon. From above, the battlefield showed unconscious bodies scattered across the floor while rescuers approached through the debris. A long-haired woman with blue eyes arrived with 2 men and looked over the survivors with immediate concern. A bearded man knelt beside Sharon and supported him, treating the fighter who had carried the battle past its normal limits. Layla was supported by another rescuer and managed a weak smile, while an injured companion still raised a thumbs up. Sharon remained unconscious and drifted through a deep sleep, carrying the fire spirit's voice into the darkness with him. The scene shifted to the bright infirmary, a clean room that felt almost unreal after the ruined dungeon and its purple flames. Sharon sat up, with one arm heavily bandaged, and stared at it as if the seal belonged to someone who had survived in his place. He clenched the bandaged hand and tested the remaining strength, careful not to awaken the fire without understanding its cost. A memory returned of Sharon touching someone's head while magical energy moved through his hand, linking the new power to an older promise. A small smile appeared as Sharon accepted that the power had chosen him for a reason, even if the reason was still hidden. He clenched the bandaged hand again and prepared himself to investigate instead of treating recovery as permission to ignore the danger. A bearded man peeked through the doorway and checked on Sharon before deciding whether the conversation could begin. The man pulled up a chair beside the bed, and Sharon sat alert because a visitor this serious rarely arrived with good news. Sharon listened calmly, his blue eyes clear despite the bandages and the exhaustion still sitting under his expression. The bearded man leaned forward and spoke with the pain of someone delivering information that had already cost students their safety. He looked down while explaining the situation, weighing every word because Giovanni's ambition had damaged the Academy's confidence. A blank pause filled the room as Sharon processed how close the dungeon incident had come to becoming a mass casualty event. The bearded man closed his eyes and continued, sounding weary from the responsibility of failing to notice the threat sooner. He looked directly at Sharon and waited for the injured student to understand the seriousness behind the warning. A flashback showed a council gathered around a library table, where senior figures reviewed the disaster as a failure of judgment. The bearded man gave a pained smile, admitting that the Academy had overlooked Giovanni's ambition and placed its students in danger twice. Sharon gestured while answering, trying to explain what happened in the dungeon, without revealing more uncertainty than the adults could handle. Pain flashed through his injured arm when he moved, reminding the room that the battle's consequences were still physical, not just political. The bearded man reached out to support him as the pain worsened, shifting from investigator to protector in a single motion. He gave Sharon a thumbs up and tried to lighten the mood, offering encouragement where another warning would have crushed the room. Sharon stared in surprise at the sudden optimism, then realized the gesture was the man's way of saying the team had survived together. The bearded man sat back down and waited for Sharon's response, leaving space for the injured fighter to choose what came next. He stood beside the bed in a vest and white shirt, presenting the meal with the stern professionalism of someone who expected Sharon to eat. The bald man offered the food, and Sharon looked surprised that anyone was treating a forbidden power incident like an ordinary hospital visit. The bearded man suddenly stood and glared at the newcomer, turning the meal delivery into a confrontation built from old tension. He leaned over the bald man with a stern expression, while Sharon watched the strange rivalry from the bed. The bald man returned to the bedside and waited for Sharon to take the food, refusing to let the argument replace basic care. A flashback showed the bald man grabbing Sharon by the collar, proving their hostility came from a history far older than the infirmary. He explained that he had once been an honor student, but realized his only path in the academy was close combat magic. The memory showed students gathered in a dim room, suggesting the bald man's past was tied to the same system that had shaped Sharon. A glowing magical symbol appeared on a hand, linking the bald man's history to the seal now burning on Sharon's skin. The bald man revealed the same symbol on his own hand, showing that the connection was not a coincidence or a simple mark of injury. He raised a paper and spoke more seriously, offering Sharon information instead of another physical demonstration. A small smile touched his mouth, making the secret feel less like a threat and more like an invitation to understand the power. The bald man gestured toward Sharon while the room's mood softened, and Sharon answered with a cautious, friendly smile. Sharon smiled quietly, recognizing that the conversation had moved from accusation toward a possible agreement. He sat up with a plate of sliced food and gestured with the bandaged hand, proving that recovery and investigation could happen at the same time. Kaiser shook Sharon's hand and revealed a glowing yellow crest, sealing their agreement with a sign more serious than the meal on the tray. Kaiser left the room while the muscular professor remained beside Sharon, watching the door close behind the new ally. The professor's expression became solemn after Kaiser departed, signaling that the next information was not meant for casual conversation. He held up a gray glove patterned with gold diamonds, presenting an object connected to the Academy's most restricted knowledge. The professor spoke seriously while holding the glove, preparing Sharon for a secret that could not be written into an ordinary lesson. His orange eye filled the frame, emphasizing that the warning about the glove and its magic was not exaggerated. Sharon placed the plate on the bedside table and gave the professor his full attention. The professor warned him about forbidden magic, lowering his voice as if even the walls were not allowed to hear the name. A historical scene showed mages using green wind and yellow fire magic against one another, revealing that the forbidden art had already caused conflict. The professor continued with a stern expression and made the rule absolute. Everything connected to that magic was forbidden. A fiery demonic beast appeared behind Sharon, symbolizing the dangerous power that had already begun answering him. Sharon asked how the professor had learned about knowledge the academy had tried to erase. The professor stared back with a knowing look, preparing to reveal why he was one of the few people trusted with the secret. A flashback showed a horned, armored figure and a crazed mage surrounded by purple aura, hinting at the origin of the forbidden threat. A glowing eye and a necklace with blue gems appeared together, tying the old memory to a hidden lineage or pact. The professor explained that the secret was kept under absolute lock and key within the academy. He confirmed that only he and the principal knew the full truth, making Sharon's accidental connection to the power even more dangerous. Sharon broke into a sweat as the scale of the secret settled over him. The professor softened his expression and smiled warmly, giving Sharon room to breathe after the weight of the revelation. Sharon smiled back and released a quiet sigh, allowing the room's tension to fall for the first time since the dungeon. The professor settled into a friendlier tone and began wrapping up the conversation, leaving the forbidden magic as an unanswered shadow. He stood and told Sharon to rest, catching the student off guard with how quickly the secret meeting ended. The heavy door shut after the professor's playful farewell, leaving Sharon alone with the power in his hand. Sharon sat quietly on the bed and considered the forbidden magic, the professor's warning, and the direction his own path was taking. His bandaged hand rested on the sheet, but the seal made it clear that recovery would not stop the power from demanding attention. A fiery, red-haired entity screamed inside the silence, announcing that the spirit was awake and far less patient than the professor. Sharon wrapped the sealed hand with another bandage, trying to contain a power that had already proved it could burn through his control. He stared down at the hand and considered whether mastering the fire would require accepting the spirit instead of hiding it. Sharon looked sharply to the side when a voice answered from the quiet room, confirming that he was no longer alone. The room remained still around the bed, curtains drawn as Sharon searched for the source of the unseen presence. A dark aura appeared beside the bedside table, and the voice finally stated that it was here. Warm orange energy wrapped around Sharon's body, making the new presence impossible to dismiss as a hallucination. A small, cute, fiery creature sat on Sharon's head, turning the forbidden power's terrifying voice into the academy's strangest new roommate. Sharon woke in the infirmary to the same dark voice, which immediately warned that a mere human could not control its power. A spiky speech bubble appeared in the quiet room, making the voice feel closer than the sealed hand beside him. Sharon sat up and searched the room, still hearing the entity while every other patient seemed to be sleeping. The voice finally announced that it was here, leaving Sharon to wonder whether the danger had followed him out of the dungeon. Orange energy appeared around his body, and Sharon reacted with surprise as the crest began manifesting something physical. A small, cheerful, fiery creature appeared on top of his head, turning an ominous forbidden power into an absurdly tiny roommate. The creature leaped onto the bed and stared up at Sharon as if it had been waiting for him to notice its arrival. Sharon stared back at the little fire spirit, trying to reconcile its cute shape with the tangent-like monster that had burned him in the other dimension. The spirit sat smugly on the bed and looked offended that Sharon was treating it like a strange animal instead of an ancient power. Sharon imagined its true fiery form, and immediately remembered why speaking casually to it was a terrible survival strategy. The small spirit bounced around the room, exploring every corner while Sharon tried to keep it from setting the infirmary on fire. It reached the window and stared outside, amazed by the enormous world beyond the room. The academy complex impressed the spirit because its scale gave the creature an entire new territory to investigate. Sharon watched cautiously while the spirit looked excited, already behaving like it had permission to tour the academy. It continued moving around the room, while Sharon followed with the expression of someone trying to prevent a magical disaster one step at a time. Sharon gestured toward the creature and demanded an explanation for why it had followed him into the academy. The spirit pointed at the crest on Sharon's hand and confirmed that the connection was the reason it could remain near him. It explained that staying in its true form would require a dangerous amount of mana from the human carrying the crest. For now, the spirit could only remain in the small form, which was apparently the difference between a manageable companion and an academy-sized catastrophe. Sharon processed the explanation and realized that the creature's weakness was connected directly to his own limited mana. He looked toward the viewer with a serious expression, silently calculating how much trouble a tiny spirit could cause in one afternoon. The creature's sharp eye revealed that the cute appearance was only a disguise for a very intelligent and very confident presence. Sharon sat on the bed while the spirit contemplated something, and the pause made him worry that a new idea was already forming. The spirit remembered rampaging through its contractor's war in the past, treating destruction as a normal part of a contract. It continued discussing the past while Sharon listened, learning that the small creature had lived through experiences far beyond a student's scale. Then the spirit jumped off the bed and sprinted away before Sharon could ask the most important follow-up question. It raced through the hallway while Sharon followed, and a young girl stopped in surprise when a glowing creature tore past her. Sharon pointed after it and tried to call the spirit back, but his bandaged arms made the chase harder than his pride wanted to admit. He ran down the corridor in a hurry, determined to catch the creature before the academy learned what it was carrying. The fire spirit moved even faster and left a glowing trail behind, clearly enjoying freedom more than Sharon enjoyed the chase. It reached the Mage Academy and looked around at students who stared back, immediately deciding this was the best place it had ever found to explore. Two students looked toward the commotion in confusion, unable to decide whether the glowing creature was cute, dangerous, or both. Two female students reacted with delight, proving the spirit could charm the crowd before anyone considered asking where it came from. Sharon arrived exhausted and out of breath, while the spirit asked why his human body was so weak after only a short chase. The creature struck a confident pose, making the difference between its limitless attitude and Sharon's recovering body impossible to miss. Sharon kept moving through the frustration and physical strain, determined to solve the creature problem before the teachers noticed. He entered a room and surprised two male students, who immediately treated the sudden appearance of a bandaged runner and a fire creature as suspicious. One student adjusted his glasses and looked annoyed, clearly unhappy that Sharon had interrupted the room's order. The same student touched the crest on his chest and reacted as if Sharon's presence and the creature's aura were a direct challenge. Sharon ran past the students before the conversation could become another obstacle, leaving confusion and irritation in his wake. The offended student shouted after him, treating Sharon's desperate chase as deliberate disrespect instead of a containment attempt. Sharon turned toward a larger group in the hallway and found himself facing a growing audience of students who wanted an explanation. A blonde student watched with concern, uncertain whether to join the confrontation or let the strange chase continue. Sharon ran away again, while the blonde student grabbed his head in frustration at the disappearing source of the confusion. Sharon passed a calm, bearded observer in the hallway, who watched the disturbance without joining the panic. The bearded man remained composed, taking in the chase as if he were already guessing the truth behind the fiery creature. Sharon entered another room and admitted that he had lost the spirit, which was a terrible sentence to say about something connected to forbidden magic. He found a group of students and looked toward them for help, but none of them appeared prepared for the question he needed to ask. Two female students smiled at each other, treating the chaos as amusing gossip while Sharon tried to keep it from becoming an emergency. Sharon prepared to explain himself, but the crowd's attention made the conversation harder than fighting a monster in a dungeon. He spoke with a blonde student in the doorway, still bandaged and visibly focused on finding the creature before it caused real damage. Two female students touched a glowing crest nervously, sensing that something unusual was moving through the academy. A larger group gathered while the blonde student argued with Sharon, and the hallway became a small tribunal around the runaway spirit. Sharon smiled slightly despite the tension, already planning how to turn the academy's attention away from the creature's true origin. The blonde student smiled with him, and for one moment, the argument looked almost friendly enough to stop the suspicion. Sharon's eye widened when he noticed something unexpected, and his focus snapped away from the conversation. The scene shifted to a darker stone room, where a long-haired woman watched from the shadows, adding a quieter thread to the academy's disturbance. Sharon looked serious and prepared himself for another problem, sensing that the creature's escape was not the only thing moving beneath the academy's surface. The blonde student pointed at Sharon and pushed the conversation back toward confrontation, unaware that the real danger was already outside. Sharon looked out the window and saw the fiery creature racing through the courtyard, turning his private problem into a public spectacle. He turned away from the window with urgency, while the blonde student watched without realizing why Sharon suddenly needed to leave. The small spirit leaped through the garden as students ran from it, completely unaware that its playful movement looked like an attack. Several students moved across the academy grounds with worried faces, following the commotion and searching for an adult response. The fire spirit calmly ate a sunflower while a purple-haired student watched, making the creature's innocence look even more suspicious. Sharon observed the courtyard from a balcony and realized the spirit had chosen the exact place where the most witnesses could see it. The purple-haired student gritted his teeth, losing patience as the creature ignored the danger it represented to the academy. A dark figure stood behind him while his anger hardened, suggesting the student was not acting on simple curiosity. He watched the creature run and began planning a response, his expression shifting from irritation to a more deliberate suspicion. A wide, unsettling grin appeared as the purple-haired student decided to take action, instead of waiting for Sharon to explain. He raised a glowing magical crystal while the creature kept eating in the foreground, completely unaware that an attack was being prepared. The purple-haired student justified the spell by claiming that the academy's safety had to come first. Sharon watched in shock from above and understood that the student was about to attack the spirit before anyone could stop him. The magical attack hit the creature and exploded across the garden, finally turning the playful incident into a real fight. The purple-haired student stared in disbelief and asked whether the creature had just attacked him when the blast failed to end the threat. The fiery creature looked back with a menacing expression and asked whether he had just attacked it, making the answer obvious. It launched a powerful counterattack and ordered the student to know his place as flames swallowed the courtyard. The purple-haired student screamed in agony as the creature's power burned through his defense. He ran away with his back scorched while the other students watched, finally understanding that the cute creature was the most dangerous thing in the garden. Sharon looked on with concern and realized the spirit's public debut had become an incident the academy could no longer hide. The fiery fox-like creature stood in the scorched garden surrounded by stunned students, looking completely unbothered by the destruction. Two male students pointed at it in alarm, their fear finally matching the power Sharon had been trying to keep private. The spirit dismissed the attack as nothing and asked whether the gathered students were friends of the fool it had just burned. The students gathered around the garden while an orange-haired girl held a basket of apples and tried not to attract the spirit's attention. The orange-haired girl looked nervous behind the small bandage on her cheek, clearly aware that the creature could hurt anyone who moved carelessly. Sharon focused on the scene with a bead of sweat on his face, preparing to intervene before another student mistook the spirit's calm for weakness. He moved forward in frustration and shouted, finally abandoning the careful social explanation for the direct command the creature needed to hear. The orange-haired girl raised a hand in shock, and the glowing mark there made Sharon notice another connection to the academy's hidden magic. The fiery creature looked around at the running students and asked what was happening, as if the chaos were everyone else's fault. Flames gathered around the spirit as it asked Sharon whether he also wanted to be burned, ending the encounter with a threat disguised as a question. The fire spirit grabbed a passerby's leg in the garden while an orange-haired girl held her apple basket, turning Sharon's containment problem into another public scene. Flames rose around the creature as it asked whether the next person also wanted to be burned, making the academy's panic entirely reasonable. Sharon stared down in shock, realizing that the spirit had already moved from one attack to threatening its next audience. He watched from the balcony while the orange-haired girl faced the creature below, unsure whether to intervene or trust her instincts. The girl held her basket and looked directly at the spirit through the flames, choosing to approach instead of running from the obvious danger. Her eye reflected the orange glow as she studied the creature with focus rather than fear. She walked closer, and the spirit remarked that she already looked prepared for whatever it might do. The girl knelt in the garden and offered the creature a gentle, mysterious smile that made the confrontation feel less like a battle. The spirit stared back suspiciously, trying to decide whether the calm human was brave, foolish, or carrying a hidden plan. She thanked the spirit for saving her precious friend, turning the conversation toward gratitude instead of the damage it had caused. The spirit looked away and muttered, pretending the thanks did not matter even while listening closely. It turned back with a proud expression and announced that it had lent its powers to someone, making the rescue sound like a personal achievement. Sharon watched with a worried expression, realizing the spirit was responding to this girl more calmly than it had responded to him. The girl offered an apple, and the simple gift became a test of whether the spirit's pride could be distracted by food. The creature accepted the apple and called it a good gift, instantly proving that diplomacy could work when it came with snacks. A heart-shaped reflection appeared in its eye, revealing that the spirit had already decided the girl was acceptable company. The girl smiled while the spirit ate and admitted that the apple was not bad, turning the dangerous garden into a strangely peaceful scene. The group moved into the dining hall with the spirit and its new handler, bringing the academy's most dangerous secret to lunch. Sharon smiled at the absurdity of the situation, because the creature that had nearly burned students was now sitting down for a meal. The girl continued feeding the spirit at the table while nearby students watched the impossible domestic scene. Sharon sat with them and observed quietly, letting the spirit behave for as long as the calm lasted. The creature reached toward the food, and the girl watched as if feeding an unusual pet instead of an ancient elemental power. The spirit noticed the attention gathering around them and pointed out that they were attracting quite a bit of notice. Sharon drank from his cup and tried to look relaxed, even though every nearby whisper could become another academy report. The girl joked that if the spirit kept giving gifts like this, she would make it her subordinate. The table gathered the three of them together, with the spirit between Sharon and the girl like an argument that had temporarily become a family meal. Sharon thanked the girl again for saving him in the dungeon, acknowledging that the new power would not have mattered without her choosing to stand in front of him. A red-haired student gave a thumbs up, while the orange-haired girl and the fire spirit shared the table, making the group look far more normal than it had any right to. The red-haired student turned toward Sharon with a friendly, slightly smug expression, ready to discuss their success during joint training. He held up an envelope and announced that their team had scored the highest, turning the lunch into an unofficial victory celebration. Sharon answered with a calm smile, accepting the result without letting the score distract him from the spirit sitting on the table. The group kept talking over lunch while the spirit looked happy, and for a moment, the academy incident felt like a bizarre success story. The orange-haired girl became serious as she prepared to discuss something important with Sharon. Sharon tapped his cup and grew tense, sensing that the relaxed meal was about to be interrupted by a problem nobody could solve with an apple. A vision of the purple-bladed monster flashed through the atmosphere, reminding Sharon that the dungeon's danger still shaped every conversation after the battle. His eyes widened as he started the question, unsure whether the answer would explain the creature or create a second rumor. He touched his chin thoughtfully while Sharon looked nervous, proving that even friends could tell something about the spirit was being hidden. The orange-haired girl calmly petted the spirit while the question continued, treating the most dangerous participant like a harmless pet. Her smile carried a knowing edge as she commented on Sharon's keen eyes, hinting that she had noticed more than he expected. A large bearded man approached the table and changed the atmosphere instantly, bringing Academy authority into the lunch conversation. He stood over Sharon with an imposing expression, but Sharon looked back without flinching. The bearded man looked furious, while other students carried their trays away, wisely deciding not to become part of the confrontation. He ordered the students to leave, using his authority to clear the dining hall before the argument became a public spectacle. His angry eye focused on Sharon, warning that the next words would be less about lunch and more about the forbidden creature. The bearded man pointed at the table and used magic to clear the food away, treating the spirit's presence as a violation that required immediate control. The fire spirit glared back and insisted that it was not banned, which was technically an argument about classification rather than safety. Sharon looked at the creature with concern, knowing that its confidence was about to turn a difficult conversation into a disaster. The bearded man continued yelling and pointed directly at Sharon, making the student responsible for a power he had not fully chosen. The spirit's eyes darkened inside an ominous space, and its patience started burning away beneath the accusations. The bearded man raised his hand as if preparing a spell, forcing Sharon to decide whether to restrain the spirit or defend it. The fire spirit roared with its aura blazing and demanded to know how the man dared speak to it that way. Sharon's eye narrowed as he calculated how to stop the argument before the dining hall turned into another battlefield. The bald man approached and raised a hand to intervene, recognizing that the professor's anger was about to collide with an elemental spirit. He apologized nervously while trying to calm the bearded man, a difficult task when the spirit was still glaring from the table. The bald man bowed his head, and Sharon stared in surprise at the professor, lowering himself to protect a student from the conflict. The bearded man smiled with satisfaction and reminded Sharon that a professor humiliating himself for a student was not an ordinary favor. The red-haired man slammed his hands on the table in frustration, pushing the comedy back toward a genuine argument. The bearded professor answered with clenched teeth, still irritated that the spirit and the students had turned the dining hall against his authority. A sharp eye caught the shift in the room, and everyone realized the confrontation was finally approaching a choice. The red-haired man put an arm around the nervous bald man and stood before the professor, turning the tense room into an absurd show of solidarity. He grinned widely while the bald man sweated, making the professor's authority look less threatening by the second. Sharon looked toward the orange-haired girl holding the spirit, and she nodded, as if agreeing that the adults were protecting him for the right reason. The group finally laughed together, and Sharon shook the bald man's hand while the spirit watched the conflict dissolve. The bald man wiped away a tear, overwhelmed that the argument had somehow ended with everyone still treating him like part of the team. They kept joking together while the professor watched from the foreground, with the exact expression of a man regretting every decision that led to lunch. Students whispered and giggled as the professor walked away frustrated, turning the private dispute into the academy's newest story. The professor gritted his teeth and clenched a fist, proving that the comedy had not removed the danger from the matter. He stormed away while Sharon watched calmly, already wondering what consequence would arrive after the laughter ended. Sharon looked thoughtful, weighing the friendship, the spirit, and the academy's growing list of reasons to blame him. He continued speaking with the bald man, trying to understand why the professor had stepped in so forcefully. The bald man touched Sharon's face while the red-haired student watched, turning the serious conversation into another awkward display of affection. The spirit looked grumpy and dismissed the whole situation as meaningless, apparently unimpressed by academy politics. The group moved down the stone stairs together, leaving the dining hall before another authority figure could arrive with a new complaint. A magical bird flew toward Sharon, carrying a scroll, replacing the lunch comedy with a message important enough to require its own delivery. Sharon reached for the scroll and wondered whether the sender was another professor or a new problem disguised as official paperwork. He held the scroll and read with a serious expression as the fire spirit watched from nearby. Sharon's eye widened at the message, realizing that the next task would not wait for his injured arm to heal. Elsewhere, An elderly white-haired man wrote on a scroll, sending the message with the solemnity of someone who knew its consequences. Chiron looked up in concern after finishing the message, suddenly unsure whether the Academy was summoning him or warning him. A golden, fiery aura surrounded him as the message activated a reaction in the seal. Outside the building, Chiron watched the magical bird fly away and considered the strange instructions now in his hands. An elderly woman sat near a fireplace reading a scroll, while a younger woman swept nearby, unaware that Chiron's arrival would disturb the room. A wooden bucket filled with glowing blue liquid sat nearby, hinting that the elderly woman was preparing a different kind of magic. The elderly woman looked up with narrowed eyes, and the calm room immediately acquired the pressure of an approaching explosion. Magical markings glowed across her hand as she raised it toward the bucket, revealing that the next confrontation would be powered by water rather than fire. A sharp blade of blue liquid sliced above the bucket and sent the glowing water rippling outward. The water whipped into a wide arc under the woman's control, turning an ordinary bucket into a weapon aimed at someone who had angered her. The elderly woman stood surrounded by floating blue droplets and promised to finish him with her own two hands, ending the chapter on a new threat. A council of elderly high-ranking figures gathered around an ornate table, finally forced to discuss what Giovanni and the spirit had done to the Academy's plans. Two elderly men listened with heavy expressions, while the long-haired leader weighed the consequences of exposing students to that danger. An elderly woman argued with a bald man at the table, making it clear that the council still had no comfortable answer. The long-haired leader sat alone with a document and considered a decision that would affect more than the Academy's reputation. Two men continued the discussion, one gesturing urgently while the other listened to the practical cost of the previous failures. The full council sat in tense silence and debate, turning the students' survival into a problem that required an institutional response. A muscular man appeared at the doorway and interrupted the meeting, carrying the urgency of someone who had already seen the danger firsthand. He stood face to face with the elderly leader and addressed him directly, refusing to let the council bury the incident inside formal discussion. The leader looked exhausted while the muscular man stood nearby with a hand on his head, concerned that another decision would arrive too late. The old leader's burden showed in his face as he accepted that the Academy could no longer treat the danger as an isolated accident. The muscular man remained serious and determined, prepared to turn the council's conclusion into action. He sat beside the leader and softened his voice, trying to give the exhausted man a path forward instead of another accusation. The leader finally smiled, and a tiny chibi figure in the background made the heavy meeting feel briefly less impossible. The scene shifted back to Chiron's room, where a pink-haired woman leaned over the recovering fighter with intense curiosity. Chiron's blue eye opened as he realized that recovery would not protect him from visitors with more energy than the entire Academy. The pink-haired woman laughed with her hands on her cheeks, while Chiron stared in startled confusion at the sudden attention. She pointed and gave Chiron instructions while he tried to understand why his room had become a social center during his recovery. The pink-haired woman held up a basket and explained that she had come to bring food for his recovery. Then another version of the same pink-haired woman appeared with a second basket, leaving Chiron staring at a food delivery that had somehow doubled. Chiron smiled more easily, accepting that the Academy's recovery plan included surviving enthusiastic friends. The pink-haired woman met the orange-haired girl, and both interacted happily with the small fire spirit now sitting among them. The spirit held an apple and looked satisfied, apparently treating gifts as a reliable measure of human loyalty. The pink-haired woman examined the glowing magical symbol on her hand, revealing another connection to the hidden powers around Chiron. The orange-haired girl petted the spirit while both looked comfortable, proving the creature had chosen its favorite humans with alarming speed. The pink-haired woman clasped her hands and considered the situation thoughtfully, turning a visit into the beginning of a plan. She sat with Chiron while he ate, and the two spoke easily, as if the dungeon and its monsters belonged to another week. Chiron's profile became serious as the conversation moved from food and recovery toward the information he needed before leaving. The pink-haired woman stood by the dresser with another basket while Chiron watched from the bed, already aware that the visit was ending. She waved goodbye from the doorway, and Chiron smiled because the room felt less empty after she left. Chiron returned to studying while eating, holding a magical book and treating recovery as an opportunity to understand the world behind the forbidden power. A vision showed robed figures reaching toward a central golden flame, hinting at the historical ritual connected to the spirit's origin. A map of the continent divided the world into colored territories, giving Chiron the geography needed for the journey ahead. His bandaged hands held the book tightly while he studied, proving the injuries had slowed him but not removed his determination. Chiron's eyes widened when he recognized an important connection in the material. He lay back with the book on his chest and processed the history, trying to separate what happened in this life from what his memories insisted should have happened before. A red-haired, fiery silhouette reached through a dark aura, reminding Chiron that the spirit's presence remained active even while he read. A hooded, blue-eyed figure shifted into a dark creature with a long tongue, connecting the forbidden pass to the monster threat Chiron had already faced. A blue-gemmed accessory appeared against a red background, hinting at another relic or pact waiting beyond the academy. At the academy gate, Chiron and his companion met two women and a man before setting out, with the small fire spirit joining the group. The pink-haired woman spoke with concern, making sure Chiron understood the risks before leaving the protection of the academy. Chiron and his companion talked outside with cooperative smiles, turning the departure into a shared decision rather than a forced assignment. The man in the vest gestured enthusiastically and showed that he was ready for the journey, even if the fire spirit made the plan unpredictable. The orange-haired girl crouched to pet the spirit, and the creature accepted the attention as if it had always belonged with the group. A message promised that plenty of fruit would be prepared for Chiron's return, giving the departure a warm anchor before the road became dangerous. Boots began moving across the paved ground, signaling that the recovery period had ended and the next journey had begun. Chiron smiled warmly and looked ready, carrying his new power and his unfinished questions beyond the academy gates. The two women and the man waved goodbye, sending the travelers away with support instead of fear. Chiron and his companion waved back while the fire spirit traveled with them, small enough to look harmless for the moment. The companion placed a hand on Chiron's shoulder, offering encouragement as the academy disappeared behind them. They walked through a park-like area while the fire spirit ran ahead, turning the dangerous journey into a strange family outing. The group reached a stable where an older man showed them large dinosaur-like mounts prepared for the road. The companion spoke with the stableman and received a thumbs up, confirming that transport had been arranged. The stableman handled one of the enormous creatures with practiced care, proving the mounts were powerful but manageable. Chiron accepted the arrangement and said he did not mind, more interested in leaving than debating the unusual transportation. He prepared to mount one of the large creatures, finally turning the plan into actual movement. Chiron sat on the mount ready to depart, while his companion and the spirit settled into their own positions. He smiled at the stableman with satisfaction, relieved that at least one part of the journey had gone according to plan. Chiron looked back at his companion and the stableman, carrying confidence into the road despite the questions still waiting ahead. The mounts carried Chiron and his companion away from the stable and into the distance at a speed that made walking look like a bad memory. The small fire spirit smiled with its eyes closed, enjoying the ride as if it had never been the source of an academy-wide crisis. They rode through the forest at dusk while the spirit sat on the companion's lap and reacted to every unexpected movement. Chiron's face became alert as the road changed, sensing a presence ahead before the mounts could reach it. Three robed figures stood across the wooded path, waiting in the dark as if they had known exactly where the travelers would pass. The riders pulled their mounts to a halt, and the fire spirit immediately stopped looking playful. The three figures were young women carrying a curved blade and staves, and Chiron noted that they did not look like ordinary bandits. The companion looked tense as he studied the figures, preparing for an attack while still searching for a peaceful explanation. One hooded woman remained calm and focused, giving no sign that the group had stopped her by surprise. Chiron watched carefully and measured the formation, refusing to treat three silent figures in a forest as a simple misunderstanding. The companion gestured toward them and tried to communicate, keeping one hand ready in case the answer came through magic instead of words. Another hooded figure stood equally calm and ready, confirming that the three were waiting for a confrontation. A close-up of a hooded mouth suggested a command was about to be spoken, and the silence on the road tightened around the group. Chiron's eyes sharpened as he recognized the threat and accepted that the peaceful journey had ended at the forest road. The figures held their ground while the riders approached, creating a standoff where neither side wanted to reveal its first move. Chiron and his companion stood together and prepared to defend the fire spirit and the mounts if the figures attacked. The hooded figure's eyes began glowing, revealing that they were magical constructs or dolls rather than ordinary travelers. Blue magic gathered in a hand and announced the opening spell. Chiron and his companion stared intensely, now fully aware that the three figures carried power supplied by someone else. Chiron called for the strength to defeat the girls, and a large blue magical construct formed above the road. One of the figures launched blue projectiles through the air, turning the forest path into a firing lane. Chiron manifested a glowing blue sword and positioned himself between the incoming attack and his companion. He deflected the projectiles with the sword, creating sparks that lit the forest one impact at a time. More magical shots followed, forcing Chiron and his companion to brace for a barrage instead of a single exchange. Chiron kept deflecting the attacks with intense concentration, refusing to let the dolls separate him from the group. He realized that dolls capable of releasing this much power must have an extremely strong master controlling them from somewhere beyond the road. A massive magical blast erupted and swallowed the path, ending the opening exchange with the enemy's true strength still hidden. One of the hooded figures looked surprised by the resistance, suggesting Chiron had already disrupted the attacker's expected result. Chiron's eye remained determined through the smoke, ready to answer the next spell instead of retreating from the journey. He gathered magical energy in his hand and prepared to strike back, ending the chapter with the unknown dolls finally facing Sharon's offense. Sharon watched the figures with his guard raised, waiting for the next move and the first clue to the master who had sent them.